The courtroom was packed, buzzing with whispers. The tension in the air was palpable. At the center of it all, Clint Eastwood stood, a man of few words, but those few words carried the weight of a lifetime. His entrance into the courtroom had already caused a stir. After all, this was Clint Eastwood, not just the Hollywood legend, but an unexpected, somewhat mysterious figure in the world of law. The man had spent decades making movies, crafting stories of gunslingers, tough guys, and heroes. But today, he wasn't in front of a camera. Today, he was standing in the role of attorney. The courtroom, normally a place of strict decorum, buzzed with anticipation. All eyes were on Clint, the legendary actor who'd come out of retirement to take on one of the most high-profile cases in the country. The defendant, a man Clint had known for years, had found himself in deep trouble. The charges were serious, and Clint, despite his age and newfound status as a lawyer, had taken it upon himself to defend him. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Could Clint Eastwood, the actor, really handle this? Judge Harris, a man known for his sharp tongue and sharp mind, sat at the bench. He wasn't impressed. He had little respect for actors who thought they could waltz into the courtroom and take over legal proceedings just because they were famous. The moment Clint had walked in, the judge had already begun to mentally prepare his barbs, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge began, his voice smooth but dripping with sarcasm. "I hope you understand that this is not one of your Western movies. There's no room for showdowns here, only facts and the law." His words rang out in the room, and a few chuckles erupted from the crowd. It was clear that Judge Harris was going to be a formidable opponent for Clint, but Clint had faced much worse. Clint's face remained stoic. He didn't flinch. He didn't look at the judge. He simply nodded and motioned toward the table where his client sat, waiting for Clint to begin his defense. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice steady, "I understand that. I didn't come here to make a movie. I came here to fight for my friend, just like I've fought for people my whole life." There was a brief silence. Some of the people in the room exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the aging actor turned lawyer. Clint had the presence of a man who had seen it all, and yet there was something different about him today. The swagger that was so familiar in his roles was replaced by a quiet determination, a focus that hinted at a hidden depth. The kind of depth that came from experiencing pain, loss, and the realization that you had something to prove, not just to others, but to yourself. Judge Harris didn't take kindly to Clint's reply. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm sure your friend appreciates your efforts, Mr. Eastwood, but this isn't the Wild West, and you aren't some cowboy defending a saloon. You're in my court now, and in my court, we follow the rules." Clint's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, waiting for his response. This wasn't about the judge, or even the case. This was about Clint proving to everyone, including himself, that he could do this, that he could walk into a courtroom and command respect, just like he had in the movies. "You're right," Clint said, his tone a little colder now, but still measured. "This isn't a movie. But if you'll allow me to speak, Your Honor, I'd like to remind you that sometimes the only rule that matters is the truth." The room fell silent. Clint's words hung in the air. They were simple, but they carried weight. He wasn't here for drama or spectacle. He was here for one reason: to win, to save his friend, to do something that would prove that no matter how old he was, or how many people doubted him, he could still make a difference. The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the prosecutor, a young and sharp lawyer named Laura Evans. She had been observing the exchange between Clint and Judge Harris with a look of growing skepticism. Laura had earned her reputation for being ruthless, and she knew that Clint had no legal experience to back up his confidence. To her, this was a game, and Clint was just another player. But she also knew one thing. She wasn't going to let an actor-turned-lawyer get in her way. "Your Honor," Laura said, cutting in, "I'd like to remind the court that we're here for serious matters. We're not here to listen to stories about the truth. This is a case that requires expertise, not sentiment." Clint turned toward Laura. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for the old man to respond. What would he say? How would he handle the mocking from both the judge and the prosecutor? "Expertise," Clint said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in the trenches, both in Hollywood and in life. You're right, Laura. Expertise matters. But sometimes, it's not just about who has the most letters after their name. It's about understanding people. It's about knowing what drives them and what they'll do to protect the ones they love. There was a quiet pause as Clint's words sunk in. Laura's expression faltered for a brief moment. She was used to having the upper hand, but something in Clint's tone, something about the way he said those words, made her doubt for just a second. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Enough of this banter, he said. Let's get back to the matter at hand. Clint sat down, his eyes still fixed on the judge. This was only the beginning. He knew that the mockery would only escalate from here. But Clint wasn't here to fight the judge or Laura. He was here to fight for the truth. And no matter how many people tried to take him down, he wasn't going to back down. The gavel slammed down, signaling the start of the trial. But Clint was already thinking ahead, preparing his first move in the game that was about to unfold. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood wasn't the type of man to talk much about his past. He'd spent decades building a legacy on the silver screen, portraying heroes who were always cool under pressure, who never backed down from a fight, and who, more often than not, saved the day. But behind the iconic roles, behind the persona of the rugged loner and fearless leader, was a man with a complicated story, one that few knew. Clint wasn't born into fame or fortune. He was a product of humble beginnings. Growing up in a small town in California, Clint had learned early on that life wasn't handed to you on a silver platter. His father had been a steelworker, a quiet man who did his job and expected his family to do the same. Clint's mother, a schoolteacher, had encouraged him to think beyond his surroundings, to dream big. It was from her that Clint inherited his determination, his sense of justice, and his deep need to make a difference in the world. But it wasn't until later in life that Clint discovered his true calling, not as an actor, but as a man who felt deeply about justice, fairness, and doing what was right. After spending decades in Hollywood, where he'd made millions portraying heroes who took the law into their own hands, Clint had begun to realize that what truly fascinated him wasn't the world of film, but the real world, where the stakes were high and the consequences were real. It all started after a personal loss. Clint's younger brother, who had been involved in a long legal battle over a family-owned property, passed away suddenly from a heart attack. The family was left with nothing but mounting bills and a sense of frustration. Clint, never one to back down from a challenge, had taken matters into his own hands. He wasn't a lawyer, but he started learning everything he could about the law. He began attending law school part-time, working on legal cases in his spare time. The more he learned, the more he realized that there was something deeply satisfying about fighting for what was right. Clint had no illusions about how difficult it would be. He wasn't some fresh-faced law student eager to climb the ranks. He was older now, with years of experience behind him, but he also had something that many of the younger, more polished lawyers didn't: a real-world understanding of people. Clint had spent decades playing characters who understood pain, loss, and redemption. He'd spent years showing audiences how to stand tall in the face of adversity. In many ways, his roles had prepared him for this moment more than any law textbook could. But it wasn't just his personal experiences that drove Clint to pursue a career in law. He was haunted by the sense that the system had failed his family. His brother's case had been mishandled by a careless lawyer who seemed more interested in the payout than in actually helping the family. That failure was a turning point for Clint. He had seen the ugliness of the legal system from the outside, and he knew that it needed fixing. No longer satisfied with just playing a hero on screen, Clint Eastwood had decided it was time to be one in real life. His first case had been a simple one, a small-time theft case involving a family friend who had been wrongfully accused of stealing a neighbor's car. Clint had put everything he had into the case, researching the law, interviewing witnesses, and ultimately uncovering evidence that exonerated his friend. It had been a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And it had ignited something in Clint, a fire to keep fighting, to keep challenging the system. As Clint gained experience, he began to take on more difficult cases. His reputation grew, and so did the pressure. He wasn't a young man anymore. He knew that his time was limited, that his window to make a real difference was shrinking. But it didn't matter. He wasn't in it for the fame, and he wasn't in it for the money. He was in it for the fight. And when his old friend, the defendant in this current case, had asked him to step in and help, Clint hadn't hesitated for a second. But Clint's journey had come with its own set of challenges. Many people doubted him. His colleagues in the legal field were often dismissive, assuming that Clint's name alone would be enough to win over a jury. They didn't believe that an actor, someone who'd spent years making movies and playing tough guys, could have the kind of legal acumen necessary to win a case in court. They underestimated him, and that was something Clint had learned to embrace. After all, underestimating Clint Eastwood had always been a mistake, and this time, it would be no different. Still, Clint couldn't ignore the nagging doubts that crept up at night. As much as he tried to put on a brave face, there were times when the weight of the case felt heavy. He was facing off against one of the sharpest prosecutors in the country, a woman named Laura Evans, and a judge who seemed determined to humiliate him at every turn. It was one thing to face off against villains in a film, but this was real life. This was a battle where his every move mattered. Despite the pressure, Clint had a quiet confidence about him. He knew he was in over his head in some ways, but he also knew he had a unique perspective. His years of experience as an actor had given him a deep understanding of human nature. He knew how to read people, how to get under their skin, how to get them to reveal the truth. And that was a skill that no one in the courtroom, not even Judge Harris or Laura Evans, could ever dismiss. Clint's decision to take on this case wasn't just about winning for his friend. It was about proving to himself that he could do something more, something that mattered. It was about redemption, not just for the defendant, but for him. The ghosts of his past were always there, hovering just out of sight, and this case, this trial, was his chance to prove that no matter how old or how far removed from Hollywood he had become, he was still Clint Eastwood. And he was just getting started. As Clint walked into the courtroom the next day, ready to face Judge Harris once again, he felt a sense of purpose settle in. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was the fight of his life, and he was ready for whatever came next. It didn't matter what the judge or the prosecutor thought of him. Clint had learned long ago that what mattered was doing the right thing. And that's exactly what he intended to do. The courtroom was already abuzz as Clint Eastwood made his entrance the following day. The air felt thick with tension, and the murmurs of the crowd were almost deafening. Judge Harris sat behind the bench, an air of self-satisfaction hanging over him. He had already made his position clear the day before. Clint Eastwood, the actor, had no place in a real courtroom. And now, as Clint walked in with a slow, deliberate pace, the judge couldn't help but feel a surge of smugness. The old man might have had a lifetime of movie experience, but this was a different kind of battle. Clint took his seat at the defense table, his eyes scanning the room. His client, Michael Heller, sat next to him, a nervous expression on his face. Michael had been accused of insider trading, a crime that had caught the attention of both the media and the public. The charges were serious, and the evidence seemed damning. But Clint knew better than to rely solely on the facts. He understood that in court, perception was just as important as reality, and he was determined to control that perception. Prosecutor Laura Evans was already positioned at her table, looking every bit the part of a seasoned lawyer. She was young, sharp, and relentless. Clint had heard whispers about her in the legal community. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, her ability to break down witnesses, and her unyielding pursuit of victory. Clint had no doubt that she would be a formidable opponent. The trial began with the usual formalities. Opening statements, the judge's reminders about courtroom decorum, and the swearing-in of witnesses. But as soon as the prosecution began presenting its case, Clint knew that this would not be an easy battle. Laura Evans was on fire, presenting a tightly wound narrative about Michael's role in the alleged crime. She had witnesses lined up, financial records, and testimony that painted Michael as a man who had knowingly manipulated the stock market for personal gain. Clint sat silently, listening intently, his face stoic. He had heard all of this before, and while the evidence against Michael seemed compelling, Clint wasn't one to give up so easily. He knew there was more to the story, and that's what he intended to uncover. When it was Clint's turn to make his opening statement, he stood slowly, his every move calculated. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for him to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clint began, his gravelly voice echoing through the room. "You've heard a lot about my client today. You've heard about the charges against him. But what you haven't heard is the whole story. This case isn't just about financial records and insider tips. This case is about truth. And I'm here to show you the truth." He paused, letting his words settle. The jury was watching him, and Clint knew he had their attention. He had to make them believe in Michael's innocence. But more than that, he had to make them believe in him. He wasn't just an actor standing in front of them. He was a man who had spent his life searching for justice, even in the most unlikely of places. "As my colleague has already pointed out," Clint continued, "there are documents, there are phone calls, and there are emails that paint my client in a very negative light. But those aren't the only things that matter. The truth is messy. It's complicated. And sometimes, the things we think are facts are nothing more than assumptions. I'm here to show you that there's more to this case than meets the eye." Clint's words seemed to strike a chord with the jury. He had a way of speaking that didn't come across as rehearsed or scripted. He spoke from the heart, and that was something that few lawyers could pull off. The room remained still as Clint made his case. He was just getting started, and he knew the real work would begin when the first witnesses took the stand. The first witness called by the prosecution was a former employee of Michael's, someone who had worked in the same department where the insider trading had supposedly taken place. The witness was calm, collected, and seemed to know exactly what to say. His testimony was devastating, as he claimed to have seen Michael regularly making suspicious phone calls, exchanging confidential information, and even directly instructing others to act on inside knowledge. Clint didn't flinch. He had known this was coming, and he wasn't surprised. What bothered him, though, was how easily the jury seemed to buy into the witness's story. Every word he spoke seemed to make Michael's case look worse and worse. Clint had to act quickly. He stood up, his hand resting on the edge of the table as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice steady, "I'd like to cross-examine this witness." Judge Harris glanced over at Clint, a smirk playing on his lips. "Go ahead, Mr. Eastwood," he said, clearly relishing the moment. It was as if the judge couldn't wait to see Clint stumble. But Clint was far from intimidated. If anything, the mockery from Judge Harris only fueled his determination. Clint walked up to the witness stand with a calm confidence. The courtroom watched in silence, waiting for what would come next. "You claim to have seen my client making phone calls and exchanging information. Is that correct?" Clint asked, his tone controlled, but his eyes sharp. The witness nodded. "That's right." Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming even more measured. "And you're absolutely certain about what you saw?" The witness hesitated, and for the first time, Clint saw a crack in his confidence. The man's eyes darted around the room, and Clint knew he had him. This was the moment where everything could change. "Because I've seen the records," Clint continued, "and I know exactly who you've been in contact with. You've been speaking to the same people, and I think we both know that you've got a vested interest in seeing my client behind bars." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The witness's face turned pale. Clint had just dropped a bombshell. The witness's credibility was now in question, and Clint had used his opponent's own tactics against him. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about who could manipulate the truth in the most effective way. Judge Harris slammed his gavel down, calling for order. Clint didn't flinch. He knew the game had changed. The rising conflict was just beginning, and Clint had made his first move. As the witness stammered and the prosecution tried to regain control, Clint sat back down, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He knew he had just landed the first real blow of the trial. But this was only the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. Clint Eastwood sat back in his chair, watching the courtroom descend into chaos as the prosecution scrambled to regain its footing. The witness, now thoroughly rattled, tried to salvage his credibility, but it was clear the damage had already been done. The jury was watching every twitch, every nervous glance, and Clint could feel their skepticism growing. He had done what he set out to do, expose the cracks in the prosecution's case. But the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. Clint's heart raced, not because of fear, but because he knew this was the moment that could make or break everything. He had only scratched the surface, and the road ahead was about to get much more complicated. Laura Evans, the prosecutor, was already gathering herself. Her sharp eyes met Clint's across the courtroom, and for a brief second, there was a flicker of something. Recognition, maybe, or respect. Clint wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. She wouldn't let this go easily. "Your Honor," Laura began, standing tall and gathering her papers with a cool composure that Clint admired, "we would like to call our next witness." The courtroom hushed, and Clint straightened in his seat. He knew that the prosecution was about to escalate things. This wasn't just a simple case of financial misconduct anymore. It was personal. Laura Evans wasn't just going to sit back and let him tear down her witnesses. She was going to come at him full force, and he needed to be ready. The door to the courtroom opened, and a new figure stepped inside. A high-powered CEO, dressed in an immaculate suit, his posture perfect. Clint recognized him instantly. Jack Franklin, the CEO of Franklin Financial, one of the largest investment firms in the country. He was the kind of man who could buy his way out of anything, someone whose connections and wealth gave him an air of untouchability. Clint watched as Jack Franklin approached the stand, his every movement calculated, deliberate. This was no ordinary witness. This was someone with power, influence, and a well-oiled machine backing him up. The moment Jack took the stand, Clint knew this would be the real test. As the CEO took his oath, Clint's mind started racing. He'd done his homework on Franklin. He knew about the man's reputation, his past legal battles, and his ability to play the game. Franklin had a vested interest in Michael's conviction. If Michael was cleared of all charges, the financial world would be rocked. Clint's client wasn't just a pawn in some corporate chess match. He was the key to uncovering a much larger conspiracy, and Clint was determined to expose it. Laura wasted no time, launching into a series of rapid-fire questions aimed at painting Michael as a key player in an insider trading scheme orchestrated by none other than Jack Franklin himself. The CEO was calm, collected, and smooth in his answers, each word designed to entrench Michael further in the plot. According to Franklin, it was Michael who had been the one to tip him off about key trades, who had been the one providing him with the inside information. The implications were clear. If Michael went down, so would Franklin. And Franklin had the money, power, and legal team to ensure that wouldn't happen. Clint leaned forward, listening intently, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had to stay focused. Franklin was a master at manipulating the truth, and it was exactly the kind of challenge Clint had trained for over the years. His experience on screen, playing characters who had to read people, understand their motivations, and exploit their weaknesses, had taught him how to handle this very situation. But this wasn't a script. This was real. As Laura wrapped up her questions, Clint knew it was time to make his move. He stood up slowly, walking toward the witness stand with a sense of purpose that commanded the room's attention. His eyes locked on Franklin's, and for a brief moment, Clint felt a surge of recognition. This man was dangerous. But Clint didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations, faced down bigger adversaries. Franklin might be powerful, but Clint had something that Franklin could never understand. A drive that came from something deeper than money or fame. "Mr. Franklin," Clint began, his voice low and steady, "you've made it very clear today that you have a lot to lose. Your company, your reputation, your entire empire is on the line. And I can see that you're doing everything you can to make sure it stays intact. But here's what I don't understand." Clint paused for effect, letting the words hang in the air. The jury was hanging on every word, and Franklin's expression shifted ever so slightly. He was beginning to realize that Clint wasn't just questioning the facts. He was questioning his very character. "You claim that Michael Heller was the one who gave you inside information," Clint continued. "But how is it that, in all your dealings, the only person you're pointing fingers at is my client? Why is it that when the trail gets hot, the only name you drop is his?" Franklin's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Clint could see the tension in his face, the effort it took to keep his composure. The witness was slipping, and Clint knew he had to keep the pressure on. "And here's the real question, Mr. Franklin," Clint said, taking another step forward. Why is it that every time I dig deeper into this case, I find evidence of your financial dealings with people you've never mentioned? People who just so happen to have ties to this whole mess. People who have been caught with their hands in the cookie jar long before Michael even came into the picture. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The jury was clearly on edge, and Clint could feel the tide turning. Franklin's cool exterior was beginning to crack, and Clint knew he was getting closer to something big. Let's talk about the real story here, shall we, Mr. Franklin? Clint continued. The truth isn't just about a few bad decisions on Michael's part. The truth is about power. Power that you've used to manipulate markets and people. Power that you've used to cover up your own illegal activities. And when Michael Heller threatened to expose you, you made sure he was the one who got blamed. For the first time since he'd entered the courtroom, Jack Franklin looked genuinely rattled. His eyes darted around the room, and Clint knew that he had just struck a nerve. The judge banged his gavel. Mr. Eastwood, I remind you to stick to the facts, Judge Harris warned, his voice cold. But Clint didn't back down. He had made his point. Clint turned back to the jury, his voice calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a man who will do anything to protect his empire. He's pointing at my client because it's easier than facing the truth. But the truth, as you'll soon see, is much more complicated. The room fell silent as Clint took his seat, his gaze unwavering. He could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him, but this was what he had been working toward. The road to uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy was long, and the stakes had never been higher. But Clint was determined to see it through. The real battle was just beginning, and Clint knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. As the prosecutor and Franklin's defense team huddled in whispers, Clint could see the tension building. His move had shaken the courtroom, but it was far from over. They would come at him harder now, but he was ready. The real test was still ahead. Clint Eastwood's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Jack Franklin squirm under his cross-examination. The CEO's once impeccable composure was crumbling. Franklin had tried to maintain control, but Clint could see the cracks widening. Franklin was being backed into a corner, and Clint knew this moment was pivotal. The entire case hinged on what would happen next. The tension in the room was palpable. The jury sat in absolute silence, hanging on every word as Clint delivered his final blow. It wasn't just about proving Michael Heller's innocence anymore. It was about exposing a far deeper, more dangerous web of corruption that stretched far beyond anyone's expectations. But just as Clint was preparing to deliver his closing argument, there was a sharp noise at the back of the courtroom. The doors swung open, and all eyes turned to see a woman stepping inside. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, and her presence was commanding. The woman's gaze swept across the room until it landed on Clint. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. It was Laura Evans, the prosecutor. No, not Laura. Clint's eyes narrowed as he recognized the woman who had just walked in. It was Rachel Heller, Michael's estranged sister. He hadn't expected to see her today. She had been absent for the first few days of the trial. Clint had heard rumors about her. Rumors that didn't sit well with him. Michael had always been protective of Rachel, but Clint had heard whispers that she had her own motives. She had been living in Europe for years, far from the spotlight of Michael's scandal. What was she doing here? Rachel's eyes met Clint's, and in that moment, something shifted. The room felt colder, the air thicker. Rachel had never seemed like the kind of person who would show up in a courtroom to support her brother. But now, her sudden appearance couldn't be dismissed as a coincidence. Clint had to maintain his composure. There was no time to figure out her role in the grand scheme of things. Not right now. He had to focus. But her presence gnawed at the back of his mind, and he knew that her sudden arrival was going to complicate things. Judge Harris cleared his throat, bringing the room back into focus. "Ms. Heller," he said, his voice stern, "do you have a reason for arriving at this juncture in the trial?" Rachel didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her voice calm and even. "I'm here to speak on behalf of my brother, Michael Heller. I have information that could change everything." The courtroom erupted into a flurry of whispers. Clint's mind raced as he processed her words. What was she doing? Why had she waited until now to speak up? Clint shot a glance at the prosecutor, Laura Evans, whose face betrayed nothing but quiet fury. This wasn't part of the plan. Nobody had anticipated this. The last person anyone expected to walk in and potentially turn the trial upside down was Rachel. "Your Honor," Clint said, standing up, his voice commanding, "I request that Ms. Heller be allowed to testify immediately. Her information could be the key to this entire case." Judge Harris hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. "I will allow it, but we'll proceed with caution. Ms. Heller, please take the stand." Rachel walked toward the witness stand, her steps deliberate, and the room watched in complete silence. As she took her seat, Clint's mind reeled. What was she going to say? Was she here to defend her brother? Or was there more to her story? His instincts told him that this was more than just a sister trying to help her brother. Once Rachel was sworn in, she turned to face the courtroom. Her eyes were intense, and Clint could sense the weight of her words. "I've been in contact with several individuals who have vital information about this case," Rachel began, her voice cool and steady. "But it's not just Michael who's being targeted here. There's something bigger going on." Clint's stomach dropped. This was the moment where everything could either come together or fall apart. He was listening to every syllable with laser focus. "My brother," Rachel continued, "has been a pawn in a much larger game. A game that involves people who have been pulling the strings from the very beginning. And those people have already started to cover their tracks." Clint's heart began to race again. It was happening. The truth was beginning to emerge. Rachel wasn't just here to clear her brother's name. She was here to expose a system that had been hiding behind the facade of corporate greed and political manipulation. She paused for a moment, taking a breath before speaking again. "I have documents. Proof that my brother didn't initiate any of the trades. The real culprits are in this room. They've been hiding behind a wall of deceit, using Michael as their scapegoat." Clint's mind began to race as he processed her words. She had proof. Real proof. And if what she was saying was true, then this trial wasn't just about insider trading. It was about uncovering the truth behind an entire system of corruption. Rachel's eyes met Clint's as she spoke again. "I know who is responsible. And I know that Michael has been framed." Clint knew this was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Rachel's testimony had just shattered the carefully constructed illusion that the prosecution had built up over the last few days. Her words were like a bombshell, detonating the foundation of the case and revealing that there was so much more beneath the surface. "Ms. Heller," Clint said, stepping forward, "can you explain what you mean by the real culprits? Who are you referring to?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "It's Jack Franklin. He's the mastermind behind this whole scheme. He's the one who orchestrated the insider trading and used my brother as a pawn. But there's someone else. Someone even higher up. I'm talking about politicians who have been leveraging their power for personal gain, and Franklin's firm has been laundering money for them." The courtroom gasped collectively. The walls of the case that had seemed impenetrable were now falling apart, piece by piece. Jack Franklin's calm demeanor faltered. His eyes flicked to Rachel, then back to Clint, as if he were trying to calculate his next move. "Your Honor, this is preposterous," Franklin's attorney shouted, standing to object. "This woman has no evidence to back up her claims." Judge Harris banged his gavel. "I will allow Ms. Heller to continue, but if her testimony doesn't hold up, I'll consider contempt of court. Proceed, Ms. Heller." Rachel didn't flinch. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "The truth is, Franklin and his backers thought they could get away with everything. But my brother is innocent. He's been set up, and I can prove it." Clint looked at Rachel, his mind processing the weight of her words. This was the emotional climax, the point where the truth was finally coming to light. The stage had been set, and now it was clear. Michael Heller's fate was no longer in the hands of a flawed system. The real battle was about to unfold. Clint turned to the jury, his eyes intense. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. The moment when the truth finally breaks through the lies." The courtroom was silent as the weight of Rachel's words settled in. The emotional crescendo had arrived, and the real journey was only just beginning. But Clint was ready. The room was thick with tension, a sense of anticipation hanging in the air as Rachel Heller's bombshell testimony reverberated in the courtroom. Everyone was on edge, including Clint. His mind raced, processing the enormity of what had just unfolded. Rachel had stepped forward with the kind of information that could not only clear Michael Heller's name, but also bring down the people who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. This wasn't just about a courtroom victory. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption. Clint took a deep breath and gathered his thoughts. The judge had just banged his gavel, signaling the break in the proceedings. As the room buzzed with murmurs and whispers, Clint felt the weight of his responsibility grow heavier. The case had suddenly shifted from being about Michael's guilt or innocence to a much bigger fight, one that threatened to unravel the power structures that had been running unchecked for far too long. The break wasn't long, but it gave Clint just enough time to process everything that had happened. He stepped outside the courtroom for a moment, finding a quiet corner to collect himself. His hands were still shaking from the adrenaline of the moment, but deep down, he knew he had made the right call by pushing Rachel to testify. She was a wild card in all of this, but now that the truth had come to light, there was no turning back. The hallway was empty, and Clint leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment of silence. He thought about his own journey, about all the roles he had played, all the lives he had portrayed on screen. There were times when he had wondered whether his experience in front of cameras had prepared him for something like this. And in that moment, he realized it had. His ability to read people, to sense when a situation was more than it appeared, had given him the tools to navigate this courtroom drama. But now, it wasn't about his own performance. It was about the people in that room, about Michael, about the truth that had been buried for so long. Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw that it was a message from his old friend, Detective Mark Sullivan. The message was brief but clear. "It's bigger than Franklin. There's a network we're uncovering. Meet me after the trial. This goes deeper than you think." Clint's pulse quickened. The detective's message confirmed his suspicion. The conspiracy Rachel had alluded to was even larger than they had imagined. Franklin wasn't just one bad apple. He was part of a much larger operation, and Clint was now in the middle of it. The stakes had just been raised. He quickly typed a reply, "I'll meet you. It's time to take them down." With a final glance at the courtroom door, Clint took a deep breath and walked back inside. He had no idea where this road would lead, but he was committed. There were too many lives at stake now, too many people who had been caught in the web of lies that Franklin and his associates had spun. The break was over, and everyone filed back into the courtroom. Rachel was still seated in the witness stand, her expression unreadable, but Clint could see the tension in her posture. She had just unleashed a bombshell, and now the court was on the verge of unraveling the very fabric of the case. Clint took his place at the defense table, his eyes meeting Laura Evans's across the room. The prosecutor's expression was hard to read, but Clint knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let this go without a fight. She was too smart, too experienced to let a surprise like Rachel's testimony derail her. But Clint wasn't going to back down, not when the truth was so close to the surface. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent once more. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Harris said, his voice cutting through the stillness, "we are proceeding with your defense. Do you wish to call any further witnesses?" Clint stood, his eyes scanning the room as he took a moment to gather his thoughts. He knew what had to be done. The next steps were critical. The jury was hanging on every word, and now it was time to bring everything together. "Yes, Your Honor," Clint replied confidently. "I called Detective Mark Sullivan to the stand." There was a murmur of surprise as the detective entered the courtroom, his badge glinting under the harsh lights. Clint had called in a favor, and now the pieces were starting to fall into place. Sullivan had been working behind the scenes, digging into Franklin's finances, his dealings with politicians, and the larger network of corruption that had been festering just below the surface. Mark Sullivan had been a detective for over 20 years, and Clint knew the man had the expertise to tie everything together. This wasn't just about Michael Heller anymore. It was about exposing an entire system of corruption, and Detective Sullivan was the key to doing that. "Detective Sullivan," Clint began, his voice steady, "I'm sure you're aware of the gravity of this case. But what I need you to explain to the court is the scope of the investigation you've been running. What have you uncovered in relation to Jack Franklin and his associates?" Sullivan stepped forward, his face grim. What I've uncovered goes beyond a few shady deals. Franklin and his firm have been laundering money for several high-profile politicians. They've been involved in insider trading on a scale that would shock most people. But that's just the beginning. We've traced some of the money to accounts linked to international entities, and it's clear this is part of a much larger, global network of corruption. The courtroom was silent as Sullivan continued. We found that Franklin is at the center of a conspiracy that involves powerful figures from multiple industries. This isn't just about illegal trades. It's about manipulating markets, controlling political outcomes, and ensuring that the wealth stays in the hands of the few. And Michael Heller was never meant to be a part of this. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The air in the courtroom felt heavy with the weight of Sullivan's words. The jury was rapt, listening intently as the detective laid out the intricacies of the conspiracy. It was no longer just a case of insider trading. It was a web of political corruption, corporate greed, and financial manipulation that stretched across borders. Clint watched as Franklin's face shifted, his usual confidence cracking. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. With Detective Sullivan's testimony, the truth was undeniable. The prosecution's case had been dismantled, piece by piece, and now there was no escaping the consequences of Franklin's actions. When Sullivan finished, Clint stood again. "Thank you, Detective. Your testimony has provided the clarity we needed. The evidence is clear. Michael Heller is not guilty of the charges against him. Instead, he has been the victim of a system that has used him as a pawn in a much larger game." The judge nodded. "The court will recess for the day to deliberate on the evidence presented. We will reconvene tomorrow." As the gavel came down, Clint felt a sense of relief wash over him. The case was far from over, but it was clear that the tide had turned. Michael's fate was no longer in the balance. The truth had finally come to light, and the guilty would soon face the consequences of their actions. Outside the courtroom, Rachel Heller approached Clint, her expression unreadable. "We did it," she said quietly, "but there's more to uncover. I'm not done yet." Clint nodded, his mind already racing ahead. There was still more to be done, and the battle wasn't over. But in that moment, Clint knew one thing for certain. He had made a difference. The system had tried to crush Michael, but Clint had fought back with everything he had. And in the end, the truth had triumphed. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Clint couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And no matter what happened next, he knew he had won this battle. The real fight was still ahead, but for Clint Eastwood, this was a victory that would stay with him forever. The city was alive with the buzz of anticipation, the evening air cool as Clint Eastwood walked out of the courthouse. The legal battle was far from over, but the day's victory had sent shockwaves through the system. The jury was now deliberating, but there was a sense that the case had already shifted irreversibly in Clint's favor. Franklin's empire was beginning to crack, and with each passing hour, the walls seemed to be closing in on him. Clint didn't linger long outside the courthouse. The press had gathered in a frenzy, cameras flashing as they tried to catch a glimpse of the key players in this unfolding drama. He had learned over the years how to navigate such chaos, how to block out the noise and focus on what really mattered. Walking quickly, Clint glanced around for Rachel. She had been quiet since they left the courtroom, her face serious but unreadable. Despite the victory, there was a heaviness about her. Clint understood. She wasn't just here to clear her brother's name. She was fighting for something much larger, something deeper. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was personal. As they reached his car, Clint turned to her. "You did great in there," he said quietly, opening the door for her. "But I can tell this isn't over for you. What's going on?" Rachel hesitated for a moment before slipping into the car. "You're right," she said, her voice low but steady. "This is bigger than just Michael. There are so many moving parts, Clint. So many people involved. Franklin might be the face of it, but the real mastermind is still out there. And they're watching us." Clint frowned. "You're talking about the people behind the scenes? The ones you hinted at during your testimony?" Rachel nodded. "Yes. I've been tracking some of their movements. They're smart. They know how to cover their tracks. But I'm not letting them get away with it. Michael may be my brother, but there's more at stake here. Lives, livelihoods, the whole system. They think they're untouchable. I intend to prove them wrong." Clint absorbed her words, the weight of what she was saying settling in his chest. She wasn't just in this for family. She was in this for justice, for exposing a level of corruption that most people couldn't even fathom. And that meant the fight wasn't just about clearing Michael's name. It was about taking down a much bigger, more dangerous network. Clint had been in this game long enough to know when something was off. The case had started simple enough, a corporate scandal, a few dirty deals. But now it had evolved into something darker, something far more complex. And as much as Clint had a knack for seeing through the noise, he realized he was in the deep end now. But for Rachel, and for justice, he couldn't walk away. "We'll figure this out," Clint said after a long pause, his voice calm but resolute. "You're not alone in this. But we need to be careful. Whoever these people are, they're not going to just fold because we uncovered a few documents. They'll come after us." Rachel looked out the window, her gaze distant. "I know. I've been prepared for this. But we have one advantage. They're overconfident. They've underestimated us. And now, they've made a mistake." The car ride was silent for a few moments as Clint processed her words. He knew Rachel wasn't just talking about Franklin. She was talking about the larger forces at play. People like the ones she was speaking of didn't make mistakes often, and they didn't take kindly to being exposed. It wasn't just a legal battle now. It was a war. When they reached the hotel, Clint and Rachel went their separate ways for the evening. But Clint couldn't sleep. The adrenaline of the day hadn't worn off, and his mind raced with all the possible outcomes of what had transpired. Tomorrow's session in court was critical. If they could keep pushing forward, if they could keep the pressure on, there was a real chance of dismantling the system that had been built on lies and deceit. But what would it cost? What price would they have to pay to bring the truth to light? He had seen enough in his career to know that the closer you got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. As he sat in his hotel room, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Detective Sullivan. "The deeper we go, the more dangerous this gets. Be careful. I've got new intel. Meet me tomorrow night." Clint read the message and let out a long breath. Sullivan had been instrumental in connecting the dots, but he had also become a target. The detective's role in this case had already put him in harm's way, and now the stakes were even higher. Clint quickly replied, "Got it. We'll talk tomorrow. Stay safe." He turned off his phone, leaning back in his chair. The room felt smaller as his thoughts swirled around him. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about something much bigger. The forces he was up against weren't going to roll over. They had power, money, and influence on their side. But Clint had something they didn't: the truth. The next day, the court proceedings resumed, and as Clint entered the courtroom, he felt the weight of the previous day's revelations settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just defending Michael anymore. He was fighting for something far more profound. Rachel's testimony had opened the floodgates, but there was still so much more to uncover. The conspiracy was larger than anyone had realized. The jury was already seated, and Judge Harris called the session to order. Clint stood, facing the room, his thoughts sharp and focused. This wasn't just another courtroom. This was the battleground for a fight that would shape the future of justice, and he was ready to take it all the way. As the trial continued, it became increasingly clear that Franklin was no longer the only one on trial. The entire system was being exposed. The conspiracy was crumbling, and Clint knew that the final pieces of the puzzle were within reach. But as the walls closed in on Franklin, Clint's gut told him that the real battle was just beginning. The forces behind this conspiracy were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, as Clint made his way to meet Detective Sullivan, the weight of everything that had happened so far settled in. He was no longer just fighting for Michael Heller's freedom. He was fighting for something much more significant: the soul of a system that had been corrupted beyond recognition. The real question now wasn't whether Clint would win the case. It was whether they could survive long enough to bring the truth to light. And as he stepped into the darkness of the alley where he had arranged to meet Sullivan, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the lion's den. But he was ready. The night air was cool, biting slightly as Clint Eastwood made his way down the narrow alley behind the courthouse, where he had arranged to meet Detective Sullivan. It was a quiet street, far removed from the chaos of the trial, But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that every step brought him closer to a much larger web of danger. Sullivan had been helpful, but Clint knew there was only so much one man could uncover in a world built on layers of secrecy and corruption. Tonight, he hoped Sullivan would be able to piece together the final fragments. As Clint reached the end of the alley, he saw Sullivan's silhouette, his figure outlined by the dim light of a street lamp. The detective stood next to his car, his arms crossed, watching the street with an alertness that Clint had grown accustomed to seeing. Sullivan wasn't just a cop, he was a hunter. And tonight, Clint needed him more than ever. "Clint," Sullivan greeted him, his voice low but steady. "Glad you could make it." Clint nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "I wasn't sure this was a good idea, but with everything that's going on, I don't think we have much choice." Sullivan exhaled sharply. "I hear you. And trust me, the last few days have only scratched the surface. I've been pulling some serious strings behind the scenes, getting access to intel that could change everything. But I'm going to warn you right now, whoever's behind this has eyes everywhere. They're well protected. They've been expecting us to make a move." Clint raised an eyebrow. "You're saying they knew we'd come after them?" Sullivan gave a grim nod. "Exactly. They're not just a group of rogue businessmen or corrupt politicians. This goes much higher, Clint. Much deeper than Franklin. Whoever's pulling the strings is tied into every major power structure you can think of: banking, politics, law enforcement. And they've made it their mission to keep that power consolidated. We've already seen how they'll fight back. Rachel's testimony was just the beginning. If we keep pushing, they'll come after us harder." Clint felt his jaw tighten. Sullivan wasn't exaggerating. This wasn't just a conspiracy to take down one man. It was an intricate network designed to protect the powerful at any cost. They weren't going to let a few exposed truths derail everything they had built. Clint knew that. "Do you have names?" Clint asked, his voice steady but urgent. "Are we talking about political players? Corporate giants? Who's at the top of this?" Sullivan glanced over his shoulder, as if checking for anyone who might be listening. "I've got some intel. It's not pretty. You've heard the name Andrew Caldwell before, right?" Clint froze for a moment. Andrew Caldwell. The name sent a chill through his spine. Caldwell wasn't just a name that floated around the political circuit. He was a shadow figure, someone whose influence reached far beyond the public eye. He had been rumored to have ties to nearly every scandalous deal in the last decade. Yet, no one could ever pin anything on him. Not directly. His name had never come up in public investigations, and yet, everyone in the know whispered about his power. "You're telling me he's behind all this?" Clint asked, his voice low with disbelief. "I don't have concrete proof, but all signs point to him," Sullivan replied, his eyes darkening. "Caldwell runs a tight ship. His connections to Franklin were through a maze of offshore accounts and shell companies. But his fingerprints are all over everything. His hands are clean, but his influence is everywhere. He's been using people like Franklin to do his dirty work, and now that things are unraveling, he's going to pull out all the stops to keep us from getting any closer." Clint digested the information. Caldwell had always been a figure of mystery, a puppet master behind the curtains. No one had ever been able to touch him. But now, with Sullivan's investigation connecting the dots, it seemed like they had finally found the heart of the beast. "But why Michael?" Clint asked, a sudden realization hitting him. "Why go after him specifically? He's just a pawn in this whole thing." Sullivan looked at Clint, his eyes hard. "That's the million-dollar question. From what I can gather, Michael was always meant to be a scapegoat. They needed someone to take the fall for the financial dealings that were being set up between Franklin and Caldwell's people. They used his company to funnel money, then threw him under the bus when it all started to go sideways. Rachel's testimony didn't just help clear Michael's name. It gave us the leverage we needed to go after them." Clint's mind raced. They had come so far, but they were still walking a thin line. Rachel had exposed Franklin's role, but Caldwell's involvement changed everything. If they went after Caldwell, it wasn't just a matter of winning a case. It would be a direct confrontation with some of the most powerful people in the country. "Do we have enough to go public with this?" Clint asked, his voice tight. Sullivan shook his head. "Not yet. We're still piecing everything together. But here's the thing. If we don't act fast, Caldwell will move before we can make our move. I'm not sure how much longer we have. Clint looked at Sullivan, his expression hardening. Then we move now. We keep up the pressure. Franklin's already crumbling. It's time to put Caldwell on notice. Sullivan's eyes flickered with something between caution and admiration. You're not thinking small, are you? Clint gave a half-smile. I never do. The two men exchanged a look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The game had just gotten much bigger. Now, they weren't just trying to clear Michael Heller's name. They were about to take down one of the most powerful people in the country. And in doing so, they would expose an entire system of corruption that had been festering for years. But Clint knew the dangers they were about to face. Caldwell wouldn't go down without a fight. Whoever was behind this had the means to protect themselves, to destroy anyone who posed a threat. You sure you're ready for this? Sullivan asked, his voice serious. Clint didn't hesitate. I've been ready for this my entire life. With that, the two men parted ways. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took was pushing them deeper into dangerous territory. But there was no turning back now. The pieces were falling into place, and for the first time, Clint felt like he had a real chance of bringing the truth to light. As he made his way back to his hotel room, Clint knew they were in for the fight of their lives. But one thing was certain. Whoever they were up against, Clint Eastwood wasn't about to back down. Clint's night was restless. The realization that Andrew Caldwell was likely the mastermind behind the entire conspiracy had set his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything they had done so far had merely been a warm-up for the real battle ahead. Sullivan was right. Caldwell was a dangerous player, and taking him down wouldn't be easy. If Clint was going to make it through this, he had to be more strategic, more precise than ever before. The next morning, Clint found himself on the phone with Rachel. He hadn't seen her since the trial wrapped the day before, and he needed to update her on what Sullivan had shared. As much as Rachel wanted to stay focused on clearing Michael's name, Clint knew it was time for them to talk about the bigger picture, the one that involved Caldwell, corruption, and power that reached far beyond the courtroom. Rachel, we need to talk, Clint said as soon as she picked up. You've got to prepare yourself. This isn't just about Franklin anymore. What do you mean? Rachel asked, her voice sounding alarmed. It's bigger than that. Much bigger, Clint replied, his voice low, deliberate. I met with Sullivan last night. He's found links between Franklin and someone named Andrew Caldwell. You've probably heard of him. He's one of those names that nobody can ever really pin down, but he's behind a lot of the shady dealings that have been going on for years. This goes all the way to the top. Caldwell has his fingers in nearly every pie. Politics, business, law enforcement, you name it. Rachel fell silent for a moment, processing the information. Caldwell, she muttered. I should have known. He's the one no one ever talks about, but everyone knows he's pulling the strings. But if we expose him, it'll be dangerous. No one has ever gotten close to him. Clint could hear the tension in her voice. He knew she was worried, but the facts were staring them both in the face. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. This was a fight for their lives. I know it's dangerous, Rachel, but we've already gone too far. If we back down now, all of this will be for nothing. Franklin will walk free, and Caldwell will continue to operate from the shadows. We have to stop him before he can cover his tracks. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Rachel spoke again, her voice firmer this time. You're right. I'll do whatever it takes. But we need to be smart about this. Caldwell is too powerful to take down head-on. Clint could almost hear her thoughts turning over in her mind. She was calculating, as always, trying to figure out the best course of action. Rachel wasn't just following Clint's lead. She was a force in her own right, and together they were unstoppable. Agreed, Clint said. We'll need a plan. I'm meeting with Sullivan again tonight to get more information. He's digging into Caldwell's network as we speak. Once we have something concrete, we'll make our move. But we need to be careful who we trust. Everyone's a potential threat now. Rachel sighed deeply. I'll start reaching out to some of my contacts. We need intel on Caldwell's inner circle. Any weak points we can exploit. Good. Keep me posted. And Rachel, don't do anything rash. We've got one shot at this. Don't take unnecessary risks. She gave a brief laugh, though it was devoid of humor. I'll try, Clint. But you know how I am. Once I'm in, there's no turning back. Clint smiled, even though he knew it was a dangerous path they were both walking. I know. As Clint hung up, he felt a familiar weight settle over him. He had never been afraid of danger. It was part of the job. But this was different. The enemy they were facing wasn't just a powerful individual. It was a network of people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. If they wanted to bring down Caldwell and his empire, they'd have to do it carefully, methodically. And that meant making the right moves at exactly the right time. That evening, Clint met Sullivan in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. They both took a corner booth, away from the curious eyes of other patrons. Sullivan looked exhausted, the weight of the case clearly taking its toll on him. I've been digging deeper, Sullivan said as soon as Clint sat down, and I'm afraid things are worse than we thought. Caldwell isn't just a puppet master in business and politics. He's tied into organized crime as well. He's got a network of people willing to do anything for him. Clint's eyes narrowed. What kind of network are we talking about here? The kind that makes people disappear, Sullivan replied quietly. The kind that makes evidence vanish. I've tracked some of his connections to underground operations, money laundering, arms dealing, human trafficking. You name it. Caldwell's involved. Clint felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had suspected that things were murky, but this was far darker than he had imagined. So, we're dealing with more than just corporate corruption, Clint said, his voice a low growl. We're talking about organized crime at the highest levels. Exactly, Sullivan nodded. And it's not just his business partners we need to worry about. It's his security. He has a private army, ex-military, ex-cops, people who will do whatever it takes to keep him in power. They're trained to kill, Clint. They don't care about the law. Clint took a deep breath, letting the weight of the situation settle in. This was no longer just a courtroom battle. It was a war, one that could cost them everything. He could feel the stakes rising, but there was no turning back now. If they didn't take action, the truth would be buried forever, and Caldwell would continue to wreak havoc on the world. We need to take him down, Clint said, determination in his voice. But we need more than just information. We need leverage. Sullivan looked up at him, his eyes filled with understanding. I've been thinking the same thing. I've got a contact in the FBI who owes me a favor. If we can get them involved, they can help us gather the evidence we need to bring Caldwell down for good. But we'll have to move fast. He's already aware we're coming for him. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it gets. Clint nodded. Then we move tomorrow. We make our case to the FBI and prepare for Caldwell's next move. This ends now. Sullivan stood up, offering Clint a hand. I'll be ready. Clint shook his hand firmly. Let's do this. Together. As Clint left the cafe, the weight of what they were about to embark on pressed heavily on him. They were on the brink of something monumental, something that could change everything. But as the shadows of danger loomed larger, Clint's resolve never wavered. He would see this through to the end, no matter what it took. The next morning, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too fast. The discovery of Caldwell's connections to organized crime had added a layer of danger he wasn't sure he was ready to face, but it also lit a fire under him. This was no longer about clearing Michael Heller's name. It was about exposing a network of corruption and power that stretched far beyond anyone's imagination. By noon, Clint and Sullivan met up again, this time at a nondescript diner located a few blocks from the courthouse. Sullivan had arranged the meeting with his FBI contact, Agent Sarah Turner. She was known to be a no-nonsense investigator with a reputation for taking down high-profile criminals. If anyone could help them take Caldwell down, it was her. Clint arrived first, taking a seat at a corner booth. His mind was still racing, but he had learned to focus on the task at hand. He needed to stay sharp, think strategically, and use every bit of his legal genius to outmaneuver Caldwell. He couldn't afford to slip up now. Minutes later, Sullivan walked in, followed by Agent Turner. She was a tall woman with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to assess everything in the room in a split second. Her demeanor was all business, but Clint could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't here to waste time. Clint Eastwood, she said, extending a hand. I've heard of you. Sullivan said a lot about your work. Let's hope your reputation holds up. Clint shook her hand firmly. I'm here because I need your help, Agent Turner. We're dealing with a man who has his hands in everything. Business, politics, crime. We need to expose him, and we need to do it fast. Turner slid into the booth opposite Clint, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. I've been tracking Caldwell for years. But like everyone else, I've never been able to get enough to make a real case against him. He's slippery, and his network is extensive. If we're going to take him down, we'll need concrete evidence. Clint nodded. I don't have all the answers yet, but I do know this. Caldwell is connected to everything. Money laundering, arms dealing, even human trafficking. This man is untouchable, but he's starting to feel the pressure. We just need to push him a little harder. Sullivan leaned forward. That's where you come in, Agent Turner. We've got intel that connects Caldwell to a number of shell companies and offshore accounts. We've got Franklin's testimony, Rachel's statement, and a few other pieces of the puzzle. But we need someone on the inside. We need someone who can get Caldwell's people talking, someone who can get us the smoking gun. Turner listened carefully, her gaze shifting between Clint and Sullivan as they spoke. I can get you what you need, but it won't be easy. Caldwell's people are trained to lie, to cover their tracks. We'll need to dig deep, use everything we have to crack this open. Clint leaned forward, his voice serious. We don't have time to waste. Caldwell's already on high alert. He'll do anything to keep us from getting close. We need to move before he's able to close up shop. I agree, Turner said, her expression hardening, but we also need to be smart. We can't just charge in without a plan. We need to hit them where it hurts. His finances, his network, his influence. Once we expose that, the rest will follow. Sullivan nodded. We'll start with Caldwell's shell companies. We've traced some of his money to a series of accounts in the Cayman Islands. We have an opportunity to freeze those accounts, but we'll need official authorization from the FBI. Turner's eyes flickered with interest. I can get that authorization, but you'll need to move fast. If Caldwell catches wind of what we're doing, he'll go underground. Clint's mind was already working through the logistics. The FBI had the resources and the authority to bring down Caldwell's empire, but they needed a coordinated effort. They had to outsmart Caldwell at every turn, staying one step ahead of him. He couldn't afford any mistakes. Here's what we'll do, Clint said, his voice steady and commanding. You get us the authorization, and we'll hit him where it hurts, his finances, his connections. We need to make it clear that we're not backing down. But we need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets. Turner nodded, her eyes narrowing. Agreed. I'll start pulling strings on my end. We'll need full cooperation from the international authorities to freeze those accounts. In the meantime, I'll get my team in place to track Caldwell's next move. Sullivan looked at Clint, his expression grim. You're sure about this? Caldwell's not going to just let us do this. He's going to fight back. Clint's jaw tightened. I know, but we've got one chance to end this. We've got to take him down, no matter what it costs. Turner stood up, sliding out of the booth with a sharp nod. I'll get started right away. Keep me updated on any new intel. We'll stay in touch. As she walked out of the diner, Clint couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. This was it. The moment of truth was fast approaching. He couldn't afford to fail, not with Michael's future on the line, and certainly not with the dangerous web of criminals they were about to expose. Clint turned to Sullivan. We've got our foot in the door now, but Caldwell is going to come after us hard. He won't take this lying down. Sullivan's face was set in a determined scowl. We knew it was going to be ugly, but we've got the FBI in our corner now, and we've got the truth. That's more than anyone else has. Clint stood up, feeling the weight of the decision settling over him. I'm not backing down. We've come this far, and now we finish this. The two men exchanged a look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were in this together, and they weren't going to stop until Caldwell was brought to justice. As Clint left the diner, he knew the next few days would be crucial. With the FBI on their side and the plan in motion, they had the chance to bring down the network of corruption that had ruled from the shadows for too long. But as the stakes grew higher, Clint also knew the risks had never been greater. The battle had only just begun, and Clint Eastwood wasn't going to back down. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days were a blur of strategy, coordination, and tense anticipation. Clint, Sullivan, and Agent Turner had their work cut out for them, but things were moving faster than they had anticipated. The FBI had already secured the authorization to freeze the offshore accounts linked to Andrew Caldwell's empire, and they were coordinating with international law enforcement to track down the money trail. However, there was a gnawing feeling in Clint's gut that things were about to get even more complicated. As Clint sat at his desk, going over the latest reports, he couldn't shake the feeling that Caldwell wasn't going to go down without a fight. Every move they made would be met with resistance, but Clint had learned long ago that the fight was never won by playing it safe. He had to be bold, relentless, and willing to take risks. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Rachel. "Rachel, I've got a lead on one of Caldwell's associates. We may have a chance to get to him before he can warn Caldwell. I need your help to move fast." "You in?" Clint didn't hesitate. He knew Rachel's instincts were always spot on, and if she was reaching out to him, it meant things were about to get real. "Clint, I'm in. Let's meet." Minutes later, they were face-to-face at a secluded cafe on the outskirts of town. Rachel looked every bit the professional, her usual confident demeanor softened slightly by the weight of the situation. "I've been following one of Caldwell's guys," she said, sliding into the booth across from Clint. "He's been living under the radar, but I managed to track him down. His name's Ryan Jensen, and he's one of Caldwell's enforcers. He's been running a few of Caldwell's illegal operations, money laundering, trafficking, you name it." Clint leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Where is he now?" "I've got a location on him. He's holed up at a warehouse in the industrial district. We've got a small window of opportunity before he moves again," Rachel replied, her voice low and urgent. "But we need to act fast. If we catch him, we might be able to get the intel we need to bring down Caldwell." Clint's mind raced. This could be their breakthrough, the moment they finally had something concrete to hand over to the FBI that would tie Caldwell to the crimes they had suspected for so long. But there was a catch. Getting close to Jensen wouldn't be easy. Caldwell's enforcers weren't exactly known for their cooperation. "Do you have backup?" Clint asked, already calculating the risks. Rachel nodded. "I've got a few trusted people on standby, but we'll have to move quickly, and we can't afford to make a scene. If Jensen gets wind of us, he'll vanish, and we'll lose our chance." Clint weighed his options. Time was running out, and they couldn't afford to let Caldwell slip away. But rushing in without a plan could turn this into a disaster. Still, he knew that in situations like this, hesitation could be fatal. "We don't have much time," Clint said, standing up from the booth. "We'll take the shot, but we'll need to be smart about it." Rachel's eyes flashed with resolve. "I'm ready. Let's go." The industrial district was dark and quiet, with only the faint hum of distant machinery and the occasional squeak of rusted metal. Clint and Rachel pulled up in a nondescript car, parking a few blocks away from the warehouse. The streets were deserted, but Clint wasn't taking any chances. He motioned for Rachel to stay low, and they both began to move quietly toward the building. "This is it," Rachel whispered, her hand on the grip of her sidearm. "Jensen's inside. He doesn't know we're here yet, but we don't have much time." Clint nodded, his focus razor-sharp. They reached the back door of the warehouse, where Rachel quickly picked the lock. They slipped inside, the dim light of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air inside smelled of oil, metal, and something foul, remnants of a place that had long been forgotten by time. They moved through the warehouse with purpose, scanning for any signs of Jensen or his associates. The place was eerily quiet, but Clint wasn't fooled. He knew that Caldwell's people were always watching, always prepared. They rounded a corner and found a small office tucked away in the back of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar, and Clint could hear voices inside. "Stay back," Clint whispered to Rachel, signaling for her to follow his lead. He crept closer to the door, trying to catch a glimpse of who was inside. Through the crack in the door, Clint saw Jensen, sitting at a desk and talking to someone on the phone. His back was turned, giving Clint the perfect opportunity to strike. With a signal to Rachel, Clint pushed the door open quietly and entered the room, his movements swift and calculated. Jensen barely had time to react before Clint grabbed him by the arm and spun him around, slamming him into the desk. "What the hell?" Jensen yelled, reaching for the gun holstered at his side. "Don't," Clint warned, his voice cold and firm. "You're coming with us." Rachel stepped into the room, her weapon drawn, ensuring there were no surprises. "We don't want any trouble, Jensen. We just want answers." Jensen's face twisted in anger, but Clint could see the fear lurking behind his eyes. He knew he was cornered, and in that moment, he realized that he had no choice but to cooperate. "What do you want from me?" Jensen spat, trying to wriggle free from Clint's grasp. "We're not here to play games," Clint replied, tightening his grip. "Tell us everything you know about Caldwell, and maybe we can make this easier on you. Otherwise, you're going down with him." Jensen hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. But there was no escape. Clint had him trapped, and he knew it. "I'm not saying a damn thing," Jensen growled. Clint didn't flinch. He had expected this kind of resistance. "You don't have to. We'll get everything we need without your help. But you won't like the way we do it." Rachel stepped closer, her voice low and menacing. "You think Caldwell is going to save you? He won't. He's already abandoned you the moment you became a liability. So, you have two choices: talk, or we make your life a living hell." Jensen's defiance wavered. For a moment, Clint thought they might actually get through to him. But then Jensen's expression shifted, and Clint knew that they were no longer in control of the situation. Without warning, Jensen lunged for his gun. Time seemed to slow as Clint reacted instinctively, slamming his elbow into Jensen's chest and knocking him off balance. The gun went off, the sound echoing through the warehouse, but it missed its mark. "Get down," Clint shouted to Rachel, pushing her out of the line of fire. The room erupted into chaos as Jensen scrambled for the gun again, but Clint was already on top of him, pinning him to the ground. In that instant, Rachel's voice rang out, calm and decisive. "Clint, he's not alone. We've got company." Clint's heart skipped a beat as he realized they were no longer just facing Jensen. There were others in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. The odds had just shifted, and Clint knew they were in the fight of their lives. The question now wasn't whether they could capture Jensen. It was whether they could survive long enough to get the answers they needed. The room felt smaller in the chaos, and Clint's instincts kicked in as he saw the shadows move. He'd barely registered Rachel's warning before the first figure emerged from the dark. It was a tall man, built like a linebacker, with a scar running down his cheek that made him look even more menacing. He had a gun drawn, and the moment he saw Clint struggle with Jensen, he raised it. "Get your hands off him," the man barked. Clint didn't flinch. His mind was running a mile a minute, processing the situation. The room was too small for a proper shootout, and there was nowhere to hide. His best shot was to disarm the guy and force him into submission before anyone got hurt. With a sharp, quick movement, Clint twisted Jensen's arm, forcing him to the floor with a thud. As the large enforcer lunged toward him, Clint ducked under the man's outstretched arm, using his momentum to send him crashing into a metal filing cabinet. It banged against the wall with a deafening crash, momentarily disorienting the attacker. Rachel was already moving, taking cover behind a stack of crates, her weapon aimed at the other figures now emerging from the darkness. There were at least two more men, maybe three. They were closing in fast, and Clint knew they had to act before the situation escalated further. "Don't just stand there," Clint shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. "Take them down before they get the upper hand." Rachel fired first, the sharp crack of her gun echoing through the warehouse. One of the men, a scruffy-looking guy with a beanie, staggered backward as he was hit in the shoulder. He cursed loudly and dropped to the ground, but it didn't take him long to recover. Clint grabbed Jensen's gun, tossing it aside before it could be used against them. He shoved the man toward the nearest crate, knocking him off balance. "Stay down, Jensen. This isn't over for you yet." As he turned to face the incoming threat, Clint saw the first enforcer recovering, rage in his eyes. But this wasn't just about brute force. Clint had trained for moments like this, where every second counted and where quick thinking could make the difference between life and death. He didn't waste time. Instead, he moved to the side, ducking low to avoid another bullet aimed his way. He kicked a crate, sending it tumbling toward one of the attackers. The man stumbled backward, distracted long enough for Clint to close the distance, slamming an elbow into his stomach. The enforcer grunted in pain, and Clint followed up with a swift punch to the man's jaw. It was fast, it was messy, but Clint didn't care. The goal wasn't to fight with honor, it was to survive. Rachel wasn't far behind, her focus laser-sharp as she took out another of Caldwell's men with a clean shot to the leg. The man dropped to the floor with a howl, clutching his wound, but he was no longer a threat. But the fight wasn't over yet. Clint was still grappling with the first enforcer, trying to pin him down while avoiding the man's flailing fists. The last attacker, a smaller man with a slick look, had found another gun hidden on the floor and was aiming it at Rachel. "Rachel, get down!" Clint shouted. But she didn't need to be told twice. She dove behind cover just as the gunshot rang out, the bullet missing her by inches. Clint sprang forward, grabbing the enforcer's arm in a vice-like grip. With a swift twist, he forced the gun from the man's hand and brought him to the ground in one swift motion. The man groaned, trying to fight back, but Clint's training was superior. He pinned the man's arms behind his back, hearing the satisfying crack of a joint dislocating as he applied pressure. "That's enough," Clint barked, his voice low and dangerous. "Stay down, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here." The enforcer gritted his teeth, glaring up at Clint with pure hatred, but he stopped struggling. He knew when he was beaten. Rachel emerged from behind the crates, her weapon still trained on the final attacker, who had wisely dropped to his knees, surrendering without a fight. The room was finally silent, except for the heavy breathing and the occasional groan of the wounded men on the floor. "Are you okay?" Clint asked Rachel, glancing at her briefly. His mind was still running through everything that had just happened, but it was clear she was in control of the situation. "Never better," she replied with a wry grin, though her face was flushed with the adrenaline. "But these guys are just the tip of the iceberg. We need to make sure they don't have backup." Clint nodded, stepping toward Jensen, who was still on the ground, trying to crawl away. "You're not going anywhere, Jensen," Clint muttered. "You've got a lot to answer for." With a swift kick, Clint stopped Jensen's attempt to flee, causing the man to collapse onto his back with a pained yelp. Rachel moved to secure the other two attackers. "What now? Do we take them to the FBI?" Clint looked down at Jensen, who was finally starting to show some fear, realizing that the tables had turned completely. "Not yet. We need to get them talking first. Find out where Caldwell is and how deep the web goes. The FBI will want to be involved, but we have to have the proof that we're on the right track. Otherwise, they'll try to shut us down before we get anything substantial." Jensen glared at Clint. "You think you can bring Caldwell down? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Clint bent down, meeting Jensen's eyes with a cold stare. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And trust me, you don't want to be in Caldwell's shoes when this is over. Talk, and we can make your life easier. Don't, and we'll make sure your future's a whole lot more difficult." Jensen opened his mouth, as if to protest, but Clint pressed further. "The longer you wait, the worse it'll get for you." For a long moment, there was only silence. Clint held his breath, watching Jensen's every movement, waiting for any sign of hesitation. Then, just as he thought the man would stay silent, Jensen muttered something that could change everything. "I'll talk," he said hoarsely, "but you'll regret it. Caldwell, he's always one step ahead." Clint's heart pounded in his chest as Jensen began to spill everything. Names, locations, key players in Caldwell's criminal network, and even plans for future operations. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. This was the breakthrough they needed. Before they left the warehouse, Clint gave one last order. "We're not done yet. Call the FBI. They'll want these guys alive. But remember, Caldwell's only going to make his move when he's sure we're getting close." As they left the building, Clint could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was just the beginning. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous things would get. But Clint wasn't backing down. Not now. And Caldwell? He was about to face the full force of Clint Eastwood's relentless pursuit of justice. Clint's thoughts raced as he and Rachel moved through the quiet, dimly lit streets. The night had fallen heavy, but there was no time to savor the small victory. The information Jensen had given them was just the tip of the iceberg, a breadcrumb trail that might lead them to Caldwell's empire. But they weren't out of danger yet. In fact, they had just entered the eye of the storm. They reached Clint's car, parked a block away from the warehouse. Rachel slid into the passenger seat, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush. Clint started the engine, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "Let's call it in," Clint said, his voice low and deliberate. "We need the FBI to follow up on this. But we're not done yet. Caldwell's still out there, and he's not going to sit quietly while we start pulling his strings." Rachel nodded, pulling out her phone. "I'll send the intel over to Agent Turner and get a team on this. We'll need backup for any future leads. But you're right, Caldwell's no fool. He's going to react." The weight of the situation settled in Clint's chest as he gripped the steering wheel. They had learned a lot tonight, but they hadn't even begun to scratch the surface. If they were going to bring Caldwell down, they needed more than just a few names. They needed a network to collapse. As they drove toward the FBI office to brief Agent Turner, Clint couldn't help but think about his personal stake in this fight. He'd seen enough corruption, enough criminals escape justice, to know how dangerous men like Caldwell could be. But something about this case felt different. It wasn't just about taking down a criminal empire. It was personal. Caldwell wasn't just a faceless villain. He was someone Clint had crossed paths with before. Someone who had made a target of Clint and his family in the past. That, Clint realized, was what made him dangerous. Caldwell wasn't only driven by greed. He was driven by a need to prove something, to dominate. "Clint," Rachel said, her voice breaking through his thoughts, "I've been thinking about something." "Yeah." Clint glanced over at her, his brow furrowed. "I think we're missing something big. We've got Jensen's intel, but Caldwell's not a small-time criminal. He's playing a long game here, and I don't think we're seeing the full picture." Clint felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Rachel hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Caldwell has connections everywhere. He's been building this network for years, maybe even decades. We've been chasing the wrong leads, Clint. We're focused on the foot soldiers, the middlemen. But the real power, his real power, is in the politicians, the people who make the rules." Clint was quiet for a moment as the implications of Rachel's words sank in. She was right. They had been working on the assumption that Caldwell was just a criminal kingpin who ran a tight ship. But if he had infiltrated the very institutions meant to stop him, the police, the courts, the government, then they were facing something far more dangerous than they'd ever realized. "Caldwell's got people in power," Clint muttered. "People who could derail everything we're trying to do." Rachel looked out the window, her expression darkening. "Exactly. And if we don't figure out who's working for him, we'll never take him down. We'll be outmatched before we even start." Clint's mind started to race, piecing together the puzzle. "We need to find out where he's hiding. If we can track him to a secure location, get in, and arrest him, maybe we can cut the head off the snake. But if we don't deal with his network of insiders first, they'll tip him off before we even get close." Rachel finished his thought. "We need to shut down Caldwell's operations at every level. His street enforcers, his business connections, and his political allies." It was an ambitious plan, and one that Clint wasn't sure would work. But they had no choice. The stakes had been raised, and they couldn't afford to let Caldwell slip through their fingers again. They arrived at the FBI office just before dawn, the city beginning to stir as the first light of morning broke through the horizon. Agent Turner was already waiting for them, her face tense as she sat at a desk in the conference room, reviewing some files. "We've got a problem," Turner said as soon as they walked in. "The intel you brought us is solid, but it's clear we're not dealing with a simple operation here. Caldwell's been playing us for a long time." Clint didn't mince words. "We know. We need to focus on his network, his people in positions of power. We've got to take them down before we can go after Caldwell himself." Turner looked at Clint, her eyes narrowing in thought. "We've been tracking his associates for months. There are whispers of high-level corruption, but nothing concrete. If we push too hard, we risk losing everything we've built. But you're right. This isn't just about street crime. It's about political influence. Then we start at the top, Rachel said, her voice steady and decisive. We find the key players, judges, politicians, law enforcement officials, and we hit them all at once. Clint nodded. We've been chasing the wrong leads. If we don't have the right people in the room, we'll never break the chain. And Caldwell will keep getting away with it. Turner sighed, leaning back in her chair. You're asking for a lot. But if we move carefully, we might be able to dismantle his network from the inside. We just need to make sure we don't tip off the wrong people. Clint leaned in, his eyes burning with determination. We'll move fast. We can't afford to waste time. The longer we wait, the more chance Caldwell has to cover his tracks. Turner tapped her fingers on the desk, deep in thought. I'll get the ball rolling, but we'll need your help. The FBI has resources, but we need boots on the ground. And if we do this, there's no going back. Caldwell won't hesitate to retaliate. Clint's jaw tightened. We're ready. We've come too far to stop now. As they left the FBI office, Clint's mind was already working through the logistics. Rachel was right. This fight was no longer just about taking down a criminal. This was about exposing the corruption that ran deep through every level of society. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but Clint was prepared to see it through. He had no intention of letting Caldwell or anyone else get away with it. But as Clint looked out at the city skyline, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more dangerous. Caldwell wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a kingpin with an army of loyal followers, and Clint knew that every step they took from here on out would be met with resistance, threats, and deadly force. One thing was clear. The clock was ticking, and they were running out of time. Clint couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger as he and Rachel sat in the car outside of the FBI office. Their strategy was set, but the stakes were higher than ever. They were about to step into the lion's den, going after not just Caldwell's criminal associates, but the powerful figures who were protecting him from the law. They needed to dismantle his empire, piece by piece, before he had a chance to retaliate. Clint glanced over at Rachel, who was scribbling notes on her phone. She was always calm in situations like this, but Clint could see the tension in her eyes. They had crossed a line. They weren't just fighting Caldwell anymore. They were up against the very systems that were supposed to protect the public. Do you ever wonder how deep this goes? Rachel asked, her voice steady, though her expression was troubled. I mean, the more we uncover, the more it feels like this whole city might be in on it. Clint's jaw tightened as he thought about it. That's the scariest part. Caldwell doesn't just have money and muscle. He's got connections in every corner of the system. Judges, politicians, cops. You start going after him, and you might as well be taking on the whole damn city. Rachel nodded in agreement. And it's not just the ones we know about. There are probably dozens of people we haven't even thought to look at yet. This isn't just a crime syndicate, it's a network of corruption. Clint's mind raced as he thought back on everything they had uncovered so far. Jensen's confession had been a start, but it wasn't nearly enough to take down Caldwell. The man had been playing a long game, and it was clear that they were only seeing the tip of the iceberg. If they were going to bring him to justice, they needed to think bigger. All right, Clint said, turning to face Rachel. We need to identify the key players in Caldwell's network. Start with his money trail. The FBI has resources, but we'll need to dig deeper. Find the connections we can't see on the surface. Follow the money, and we might just find the thread that unravels the whole operation. Rachel looked at him, her eyes narrowing in focus. I'll talk to Turner. See if we can get access to financial records and make a list of Caldwell's known associates. But we'll need to be careful. The more we dig, the more likely it is someone will notice. Clint nodded. No mistakes. We're moving fast and hitting hard. We don't want to give Caldwell a chance to cover his tracks. The next few days were a whirlwind. Clint and Rachel worked tirelessly, combing through bank records, connecting dots between Caldwell's known associates and their political allies, and making connections that no one had seen before. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous the situation became. Every lead seemed to open up new questions. Every time they thought they were getting closer to finding Caldwell, they hit another dead end. The network he had built was so vast and intricate that Clint started to wonder if they would ever be able to take him down. Every time they got a step ahead, Caldwell seemed to be one move ahead of them. The pressure was mounting, and it wasn't just from Caldwell's end. The FBI, while supportive, was becoming increasingly concerned about the risks involved. They had been given access to the information, but they couldn't act without solid proof. And Clint knew that even if they did get the proof they needed, Caldwell's power in the city would ensure that any arrest was met with opposition at every turn. Rachel was the first to crack under the weight of the investigation. They had been working non-stop for nearly 72 hours when she finally pulled Clint aside, her face pale and exhausted. "I think I've found something," she said, her voice strained. "I've been going through Caldwell's financials, and there's a pattern. He's been funneling money into shell corporations all over the country. But there's one that stands out. It's linked to a company in Nevada, a company with ties to a high-ranking judge in this district." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "You think Caldwell has been bribing the judiciary?" Rachel nodded. "Not just that. There's a judge named Charles Lawson who has been involved in several high-profile cases that Caldwell's associates have been connected to. I looked into Lawson's financials, and it's all lining up. If we can get concrete proof that Lawson is on Caldwell's payroll, we'll have a smoking gun." Clint's mind was racing. This could be it. If we take Lawson down, we could get a lead on Caldwell's next move. But we need solid proof. No more half-baked theories. We have to be sure. Rachel nodded, but Clint could see the doubt in her eyes. She knew as well as he did how much was riding on this. If they moved too quickly, they risked losing everything. Caldwell had too many connections, too many people willing to protect him. "We don't have a choice," Clint said firmly. "We move fast. If Lawson is dirty, we need to get him before he can warn Caldwell." That night, Clint and Rachel prepared for their next move. They had spent hours compiling everything they had on Judge Lawson, making sure they had irrefutable evidence before they confronted him. The FBI had been alerted, but Clint knew they had to act quickly. The longer they waited, the greater the chance that Caldwell would pull the strings and make his escape. Clint stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. Rachel was checking her equipment, loading her gun, and making sure everything was ready. It was strange, he thought, how easily this kind of life had become second nature to them. But the weight of the investigation was heavier than ever now. They weren't just hunting down a criminal. They were trying to expose the rot at the heart of the city, and if they weren't careful, they'd end up buried under it. "You ready for this?" Rachel asked, glancing over at Clint. Clint met her gaze, his expression steely. "We don't have a choice. We take down Lawson, and we get Caldwell. No more running. It's now or never." Rachel nodded, though Clint could see the same wariness in her eyes that he felt. The risks were high, but they had come too far to back down now. They couldn't afford to fail. They left the apartment, making their way toward Lawson's house on the outskirts of town. As they drove through the winding streets, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking right into a trap. But there was no turning back. Tonight, they would either expose the truth or face the consequences. The drive to Judge Lawson's house felt longer than it should have. The clock on the dashboard ticked relentlessly, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Clint could see the weight of the moment in Rachel's face. They both knew this wasn't just a routine operation. It was a turning point. Everything they had fought for up to this point, every lead, every sleepless night, would either pay off or fall apart in the coming hours. As Clint turned the corner toward Lawson's upscale suburban neighborhood, the looming shadow of the judge's mansion came into view. The house stood tall and imposing, its lights dimmed in the early hours of the morning. No sign of life. But Clint knew that the most dangerous players often operated from the shadows. No one ever knew when they were being watched, and in this case, that was exactly what made Lawson so dangerous. Clint parked a few blocks away, the sound of his engine cutting off in the stillness of the night. The two of them exited the car quietly, making sure not to draw attention. They moved swiftly, blending with the darkness as they approached Lawson's home. The mansion sat behind an ornate wrought iron gate, which was locked. But Clint wasn't concerned about that. He had a plan for everything. He pulled out a small device, a universal lockpick. A few seconds later, the gate creaked open with a low, ominous sound. They slipped inside without a word, their footsteps light but deliberate. It was risky, but they had no other choice. If Lawson was the key to taking down Caldwell, they had to move fast. They couldn't afford to wait for backup. As they approached the front door, Clint signaled to Rachel. He gave her a quick nod, indicating that they were about to breach the house. Rachel, ever calm, nodded back, her hand resting on the grip of her gun, ready for whatever came next. Clint took a deep breath, knocking lightly on the door, but not in the usual manner. This wasn't a friendly visit. It wasn't even an official one. This was the type of knock that suggested the man on the other side wasn't going to be asked for anything. They were going to take what they needed. The door opened slowly, revealing a middle-aged man in a robe, his eyes squinting in the dim light. It was Judge Lawson. "Can I help you?" Lawson's voice was sharp, almost mocking, but there was something else in his eyes, something Clint couldn't quite place. Suspicion? Fear? "Judge Lawson," Clint began calmly, his hand resting on the badge tucked under his jacket, ready for the confrontation. "We need to talk." Rachel stepped in beside Clint, her gaze hard. "It's about your connections to Victor Caldwell." At the mention of Caldwell's name, Lawson's face went pale for the briefest moment. Clint didn't miss it. The judge was good, too good to show weakness, but there was no hiding the truth that flashed across his face. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Lawson stammered, his hand gripping the doorframe a little tighter. "I've been completely—" Clint stepped forward, cutting him off. "Don't lie to me, Lawson. We have the proof. We know you've been taking money to look the other way. Caldwell's dirty money has been flowing through your hands for years." The judge's face hardened, but Clint saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. It was just a split second, but Clint recognized it. The game had changed. They were no longer speaking on the same level. It was no longer just a police operation. It was personal for Lawson now, and that made him dangerous. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Lawson muttered under his breath, almost too quietly for Clint to hear. But Clint did hear it, and it only confirmed what he already suspected. Lawson wasn't just involved. He was afraid of what would happen if Caldwell fell. "We know enough to put you away for a long time, Judge," Rachel said, her voice steady. "Unless you want to make this easy on yourself, you can help us bring him down." Lawson's lips twitched, as if he was weighing the consequences. Then, his eyes narrowed, his hand slipping to the side. Clint's instincts kicked in, and he reached for his gun, but it was too late. Lawson was already moving, darting back into the house with alarming speed. "Get him!" Clint shouted, as the judge vanished into the shadows of the mansion. They sprinted inside after him, Clint's mind racing as they navigated the dark halls. They were in a maze of polished marble and expensive artwork. This place was a fortress of wealth and power. But it was nothing compared to the fortress in Lawson's mind. He knew the terrain better than they did. He was playing them, trying to outwit them, and that was exactly what Clint needed to avoid. "Watch your six," Rachel called as she moved to the left, covering their flank. Clint knew that this was the moment where everything could fall apart. If they lost Lawson now, he would vanish into the wind, and they might never find him again. They reached the study at the end of the hall, just as they heard the faint click of a door closing. Clint pushed through first, his gun raised, but Lawson was gone. The room was empty, save for a few scattered papers and the faint smell of cologne lingering in the air. "This isn't over," Rachel said, frustration lacing her voice. "He's got to be here somewhere." Clint scanned the room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something. The papers on the desk caught his attention, documents scattered hastily. He moved over, grabbing them and scanning the contents. There it was. A list. Names, dates, places, connections to Caldwell and his inner circle. These were the people who had kept Caldwell's operation running behind the scenes, the ones who had hidden behind their suits and ties, pretending to be pillars of the community. This was the proof they needed. "I've got something," Clint muttered, his voice low and steady. "This is it. This is the key." Rachel leaned over, looking at the list. Her eyes widened as she recognized some of the names. These are big players. This isn't just the judge. This goes all the way up. Clint's hand tightened around the papers, the weight of their discovery heavy in his chest. "We need to get this back to Turner. Now." But as Clint turned to leave, he heard the faintest sound from behind him. He spun around just in time to see a shadow move across the far wall. Lawson wasn't done with them yet. Clint's heart raced as he turned sharply, gun in hand, to face the shadow moving across the far wall. The air in the room seemed to freeze, thick with tension. Time slowed down as Clint's instincts took over, every muscle in his body primed for action. He was so close now, so close to taking down Caldwell. But Lawson? Lawson had just proven that he wasn't going down without a fight. Rachel moved swiftly to Clint's side, her hand poised near her own weapon, ready to react at a moment's notice. She gave him a quick, silent nod. Both of them knew that the situation was about to escalate in ways they couldn't predict. The shadow in the corner grew clearer, and Clint's eyes locked onto Lawson, who had emerged from the darkness of a small alcove at the far end of the study. His face was pale, his eyes filled with desperation, but something else too. He wasn't just scared. He was furious. "You think you can just waltz into my house and ruin everything?" Lawson spat, his voice tight with rage. "You don't know what you're up against." Clint's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. The last thing he wanted to do was make a fatal mistake. He had to keep his head on straight. "Listen to me, Lawson," Clint said calmly, though his pulse hammered in his ears. "This is bigger than you. We have the evidence. You're not walking away from this. Help us, and we'll make sure you get the best deal we can. Fight us, and you'll burn with Caldwell." For a moment, Lawson seemed to falter. His eyes flickered to the papers in Clint's hand, the same papers that listed the names and the connections they had been desperately searching for. But then, in a flash, his eyes narrowed. The look on his face changed from fear to defiance. "You think I'm scared of you?" Lawson growled, taking a step closer. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Caldwell isn't the mastermind here. He's just a puppet. You want to take him down? You'll have to go through me first." Rachel's voice was cold and steady as she spoke. "We don't have time for games, Lawson. We know you're involved with Caldwell. We know you've been taking bribes. You can make it easy, or you can make it hard. But we're taking you down one way or another." Lawson didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his back, his face hardening. "You're too late," he sneered. "Caldwell's already made his move. You think you can outsmart him? He's got people in places you couldn't even imagine." Clint's mind raced. Lawson's words hit him harder than he expected. What was Caldwell planning? Had he already prepared for the investigation? Had he moved his operations into the shadows, waiting for Clint and Rachel to make a misstep? Before Clint could respond, Lawson made a sudden, swift move. He reached for a drawer on the side of the desk, and Clint's instincts screamed for action. In one fluid motion, Clint crossed the room, grabbing Lawson by the arm and slamming him against the desk. "You're not making any more moves, Lawson," Clint growled. His face was inches from the judge's, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "You're done. We're getting Caldwell, and you're going to help us, or you'll spend the rest of your life behind bars." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, two forces of will pushing against each other. But Lawson didn't break. Instead, his lips twisted into a smirk, and for a brief second, Clint felt a cold chill run down his spine. "You think this is over?" Lawson said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're going to take down Caldwell with a couple of papers and a gun? Think again. He's already gone. You'll never find him now. He's disappeared. And when the dust settles, you'll be the ones left holding the bag." Clint's heart skipped a beat. What was Lawson trying to tell him? Was Caldwell really gone? Or was this just another one of his manipulative games? "I don't know what you're talking about," Clint replied, his voice unwavering. "Caldwell isn't going anywhere. And neither are you." Rachel stepped forward, her eyes sharp. "We don't need to play games with you, Lawson. If you want to make it out of this alive, you'll cooperate." Lawson's eyes flickered to the papers in Clint's hand once again. He seemed to weigh his options before his expression shifted, just for a moment. A hint of resignation passed through his gaze. "You want to know where Caldwell is?" Lawson said quietly. His voice had lost some of its edge. "You're too late. He's already gone underground. He knows what's coming." Clint's grip on Lawson tightened. "Where is he, Lawson? Tell me. We don't have time for this." The judge's lips twitched as if considering a final, desperate move. Then, finally, he spoke. Caldwell has a network of safe houses, places he can disappear into if things get too hot. You're not going to find him at any of the places you've been looking. But there's one place left. A location he hasn't used yet, and he'll be there until the heat dies down. But getting to it won't be easy. He's got people watching every move. Clint's mind raced. This was it. This was the break they had been waiting for. They finally had a lead on Caldwell's whereabouts. Rachel was already pulling out her phone, ready to relay the information to Turner and the FBI. Clint knew that they had to move quickly before Caldwell slipped through their fingers once again. "I'll give you the address," Lawson said, his voice reluctant. "But you need to understand one thing. Even if you get to him, you won't stop him. He's too connected, too dangerous. You'll be walking right into a trap." Clint didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice, Lawson. We're going after him, tonight." Lawson's gaze darkened as he reluctantly handed over the address. Clint could see the deep sense of betrayal in the judge's eyes, the realization that he was about to be left to face the consequences of his actions. But none of that mattered now. They had their lead, and with it, they were one step closer to taking down Victor Caldwell, for good. Clint stared at the address in his hand, the digits burning into his memory. The reality of what was about to happen settled heavily in the pit of his stomach. They had the lead, yes, but there was a gut-wrenching feeling that the worst was still ahead of them. Lawson might have given them Caldwell's location, but it wasn't as simple as just showing up and arresting him. They had been in this situation too many times, where every plan seemed perfect until it collapsed in on itself. The mansion seemed colder now. As Clint scanned the papers once more, his thoughts raced. The judge's words echoed in his mind. "You won't stop him. He's too connected, too dangerous." Rachel stood beside him, her face set with determination. But Clint could see the same wariness in her eyes. She had always been the one to keep her cool, but even she couldn't ignore the uncertainty in the air. "We have to move now," Clint said, his voice low, almost to himself. Rachel nodded, pulling her phone out again to make the call to Turner. Clint watched as she spoke briefly to their boss, her words sharp, calculated. It didn't take long for Turner's voice to come through the phone, confirming that the FBI was already mobilizing. They would be ready within the hour. Clint pocketed the papers and signaled for Rachel to follow him. They made their way out of the mansion, keeping low and moving quickly to the car. As they drove through the quiet streets of the upscale neighborhood, the world around them felt distant. Their focus was razor-sharp. No distractions, no mistakes. The plan was simple: get to the location, arrest Caldwell, and end this. But Clint knew it wouldn't be that easy. It never was. Hours later, the cold night air wrapped around them like a suffocating shroud as Clint and Rachel arrived at the address Lawson had provided. It was an old, run-down building on the outskirts of town, a stark contrast to the gleaming palaces of power they had come from. The building looked abandoned, but Clint had learned long ago to trust nothing at face value. The street was deserted, the only sound being the faint hum of the distant highway. The place had the air of a ghost town, but Clint could feel the tension in the air. They were close, too close, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Caldwell knew they were coming. "Stay sharp," Clint murmured as he approached the building. He motioned for Rachel to cover the back while he moved around the front. They worked in perfect sync, knowing the stakes were too high for anything less. Clint crept around the corner of the building, his gun drawn. The front door was slightly ajar, as if it had been left that way on purpose. His heart rate spiked. There was no sign of movement, but that only meant one thing. Caldwell was in there, waiting. He exchanged a quick glance with Rachel, who nodded in silent understanding. They moved in. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Broken furniture littered the ground, and the walls were covered in grime. There was no sign of life, no indication that anyone had been there in recent days, except for one thing. Clint's eyes landed on a small, flashing light in the corner of the room. A camera. It was positioned perfectly to catch every angle of their approach. He motioned for Rachel to stay low, signaling for her to move toward the back. The trap was set, but Clint was no stranger to traps. He knew how to handle them. "He's here," Clint whispered into his radio, keeping his voice steady, "and he's expecting us." Rachel's face tightened with resolve. Then we do this smart. They split up, Clint taking the front and Rachel covering the rear. Every sense was heightened as they moved through the building, careful not to trigger any alarms. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft creaks of the floorboards beneath their feet. Clint pushed deeper into the building, his pulse quickening as the weight of the moment hung over him. They were getting close. He could feel it in his bones. Caldwell was somewhere here, waiting for them, watching their every move. And that's when Clint heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible click. The sound of a door opening. His heart skipped a beat. Before he could react, a loud bang echoed through the building. The sound of gunfire. Rachel's voice crackled through the earpiece. Clint, we've been hit. I'm pinned down. They're coming from the left side. Clint's mind raced. He knew this was a setup. The trap was sprung, and they were right in the middle of it. They couldn't fight their way out without backup, but Turner's team wasn't close enough yet. Clint dashed toward the sound of Rachel's voice, his gun raised and ready. Every corner he rounded felt like an eternity. But when he finally found her, she was crouched behind a stack of wooden crates, her weapon aimed toward the entrance. "Get down!" she yelled as another round of gunfire sliced through the air. Clint dropped low, finding cover beside her. He could see the outlines of at least 4 men in the shadows, armed and dangerous. They were waiting for the right moment to pounce. Rachel looked at him, her face grim. "We need to hold out until backup arrives. If we move, we're dead." Clint nodded, but inside, his mind was calculating. They couldn't stay here forever. But there was no time for a backup plan. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. "We've got to push through," Clint said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. He glanced at Rachel. "On 3, we move. I'll cover you." Rachel nodded, her hand gripping her gun tighter. Clint counted down in his head, each second feeling like a lifetime. 1, 2, 3. They sprang from cover, guns blazing. Clint's shot found its target, taking down one of the attackers with a clean hit. But more came, pouring in from the back. They were surrounded. Clint's mind raced as he ducked behind a pillar for cover. "We're running out of time." The sounds of gunfire reverberated through the room, each shot ringing out like a drumbeat in Clint's ears. He crouched behind the pillar, heart pounding in his chest, eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The attackers were relentless, pouring into the building with the precision of a well-trained unit. They were everywhere. Every angle was covered. Rachel, still crouched behind the crates, fired off another round, hitting one of the men in the chest. But it wasn't enough to slow the oncoming tide. Clint could see their shadows moving toward them, getting closer, tightening the noose. "Clint!" Rachel's voice came over the earpiece, strained and desperate. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they overrun us. We need to get out of here now." Clint's mind raced. Backup wasn't going to get there in time. He and Rachel were on their own, but they couldn't let Caldwell slip away. Not now. They had come too far. "We're not backing down," Clint gritted through clenched teeth. "We need to find him. He's here. I know it." Rachel gave him a hard look, the same determination in her eyes that had driven them this far. She knew the stakes. She knew the risks. But they both knew that if they didn't finish this now, it might be too late. "We make a break for it," Rachel said. "You cover me, and I'll get to the control room. There's a security terminal there. We can use it to track Caldwell." Clint nodded, already formulating the plan in his head. It was risky, but it was their best shot. "We move on 3, Clint said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Stay low and move fast. I've got your back." Rachel gave him a quick nod, and Clint didn't need to say another word. They were a team, and they were going to get out of here, together. Clint took a deep breath, his grip tightening on his gun. The seconds seemed to drag on forever, each one stretching the tension tighter. 1, 2, 3. They moved. Clint fired off a shot, catching one of the approaching attackers in the shoulder, buying them precious seconds. But the remaining men weren't about to give up that easily. The room was alive with gunfire, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke. Rachel bolted from cover, sprinting toward the back of the building, her gun raised and ready. Clint followed closely behind, firing once more to keep their attackers at bay. But his focus was on Rachel. He couldn't let anything happen to her. As they neared the control room, Clint's mind raced. He could hear the footsteps of the attackers behind them, closing in with every passing second. They were running out of time. But then, as they reached the door, something unexpected happened. The door to the control room was already open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light inside. Clint's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the figure instantly. Caldwell, Clint muttered under his breath. He wasn't surprised to find him here. What did surprise him was how calm Caldwell looked. There was no panic, no rush to flee. He was waiting for them. Clint's finger hovered over the trigger, ready to end this once and for all. But then Caldwell spoke, his voice calm and almost amused. "I knew you'd come for me," Caldwell said with a smirk. "You've been so persistent, Clint. I have to give you credit for that." Clint's jaw tightened. "It's over, Caldwell. You're done." But Caldwell didn't flinch. He just stood there, unbothered, as if he had expected this moment for a long time. He wasn't backing down, and neither was Clint. Caldwell slowly raised his hands in mock surrender, but there was a glint in his eye. "You're making a mistake, Clint. You think you've won? You think you've got me cornered? You've got no idea what you're really up against." Clint took a step forward, gun still trained on Caldwell. "You're not getting away. This ends tonight." But then, Caldwell laughed. It wasn't a triumphant laugh. It was a hollow, bitter laugh that sent a chill down Clint's spine. "You really don't get it, do you?" Caldwell said, his voice cold. "This isn't about me. This is about something much bigger. You're playing into my hands, Clint, and soon, you'll realize just how badly you've miscalculated." Clint's eyes narrowed. Something about Caldwell's words unsettled him. This wasn't the smug confidence of someone who thought they were about to lose. No, Caldwell was a man who was certain of his victory, and that made Clint nervous. "We've got the evidence, Caldwell," Clint said, his voice hard. "We know everything. Your empire is falling apart." Caldwell's smirk only grew wider. "You think I haven't prepared for this? You think I didn't anticipate every move you'd make? You really don't understand the depths of what you're dealing with, Clint. The people I've made deals with, they're untouchable. And once this whole thing blows over, you'll be the one left in the dust." Clint's mind raced. He had to act, and fast. But before he could make his next move, Rachel's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "Clint now." Without hesitation, Clint lunged forward, firing a shot at Caldwell's leg to incapacitate him. But Caldwell was faster than Clint had anticipated. In one swift motion, Caldwell ducked, and a loud bang echoed through the room as a bullet whizzed by Clint's ear. Clint barely had time to react before the room filled with the sound of footsteps. Reinforcements. More of Caldwell's men were closing in, and Clint could feel the walls closing in on them once again. He turned to Rachel, and without a word, they both knew what had to happen next. They had no choice now. They had to get out. And if that meant leaving Caldwell alive for just a little longer, so be it. They'd finish this. But first, they needed to survive. Clint's heart was pounding in his chest as he and Rachel sprinted toward the nearest exit, leaving Caldwell's mocking grin behind them. The hallway echoed with the sounds of footsteps. Their enemies were closing in fast. The plan had changed in an instant. There was no time to arrest Caldwell, no time to process the cryptic message he had left behind. They had to survive. They had to escape. Rachel's breath was shallow, her gun raised and ready, eyes constantly scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Clint could feel the pressure mounting. The walls felt like they were closing in, the heavy air thick with tension. Every second was a gamble. "Clint," Rachel shouted as she spun around a corner. "We need to head for the back exit. It's closer. I'll cover you." Clint nodded quickly, his hand gripping his gun tighter. "On 3. 1, 2. Before Clint could finish, another barrage of gunfire erupted behind them, causing them both to dive for cover behind a nearby stack of crates. The loud, chaotic noise reverberated off the walls, each shot sending a fresh jolt of fear through Clint's body. Rachel's voice came through his earpiece, calm but urgent. "We can't keep running like this. We'll never make it out with the way they're surrounding us." Clint's mind raced. He had to think fast. Their only chance was to turn the tables. But how? Okay, we need to split up, Clint said. His mind was working overtime, calculating every possible option. You take the back exit. I'll create a distraction. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Are you out of your mind? They'll trap you. I can handle it, Clint interrupted, his voice firm. We don't have time to argue. You go now. Rachel hesitated for a split second, clearly not happy with the plan, but she knew Clint's determination. He wasn't backing down, and neither was she. Without another word, she darted to the left, disappearing into the shadows of the building. Clint took a deep breath, steadying his pulse, and then he moved. His steps were calculated, his body low to the ground as he slowly crept toward the door where he knew the attackers were waiting. He could feel his pulse racing in his throat as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. They were on a clock. If Rachel didn't make it to the exit soon, everything they had worked for would be for nothing. Just as he reached the door, Clint heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway, too close. He swung into the open doorway, firing a shot to the left, hoping to distract the approaching enemies. The blast echoed through the room, and Clint immediately bolted, taking advantage of the chaos he'd just created. Gunfire erupted around him, narrowly missing his side as he sprinted down the corridor. The attackers were fast, but Clint was faster. He could hear them calling out to each other, trying to form a perimeter, trying to trap him. But he was in his element now. He had a plan, and he was going to see it through. Clint quickly ducked into an abandoned room on the left, shutting the door behind him with a slam. For a moment, there was silence, just the sound of his ragged breathing. He took a moment to collect himself, listening for the faint sounds of the enemy as they searched the building. Then, just as he was about to step out again, the sound of a voice filtered through the door. Don't worry, Clint. You won't make it out alive. Clint's heart skipped a beat, and he froze in place, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Caldwell's voice. The same calm, mocking tone. It was a reminder that they were still in danger. Even with the odds stacked against them, Caldwell hadn't given up. Clint listened carefully, hearing the faint sound of footsteps approaching. He knew it wasn't just one person. It was more of Caldwell's men. They were closing in. He had to move. Pushing open the door as quietly as possible, Clint stepped into the corridor, his gun raised. He could hear them now, their voices low but filled with determination. They knew he was here. Clint's pulse quickened, and he moved as quietly as a shadow, inching closer toward their location. The plan was simple. Get the jump on them, take out the threats, and buy Rachel enough time to escape. But first, he needed to create another distraction. As he reached the edge of the hallway, he spotted what he was looking for. A stack of crates by the door that was positioned perfectly to set off a chain reaction. Clint quickly reached into his bag, pulling out a small smoke grenade. His fingers worked quickly, his mind racing as he prepared the grenade and pulled the pin. Without hesitation, Clint threw the grenade down the hallway. It clattered to the floor, and within moments, a thick cloud of smoke began to billow out, filling the air with an acrid scent. Chaos ensued. Shouts of confusion and panic filled the hallway as Clint used the opportunity to dart forward, moving quickly and silently. His gun was raised, and with 2 swift shots, he took down the first 2 men who had been standing guard. They collapsed to the floor with barely a sound. But it wasn't enough. There were more of them. He could hear them moving through the smoke, trying to regroup. Clint didn't waste any time. He rushed forward, moving deeper into the heart of the smoke-filled hallway, and as soon as the next man appeared in front of him, Clint fired, hitting him square in the chest. The last 2 men, disoriented by the smoke, scrambled to adjust. Clint could hear their footsteps faltering as they tried to reposition. Clint seized the moment, darting to the side and taking them both out with well-placed shots. The building was silent again, save for the distant sounds of chaos and gunfire. Clint's chest heaved with exertion as he stood amidst the fallen attackers. The smoke had begun to dissipate, but Clint couldn't afford to linger. He had to find Rachel. Rachel had reached the back exit, her heart pounding with every step she took. She had done it. She had made it to the exit alive. But as she glanced around, hoping to see Clint following her, her heart sank. He hadn't come yet. She couldn't leave without him. Not like this. She turned back toward the building, her fingers tightly gripping her weapon. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to go back in. Rachel's pulse was hammering in her ears as she stood at the threshold of the back exit, staring into the darkness of the building. The tension from the gunfight, the smoke, and the chaos still lingered in her chest. Her eyes darted nervously over the entrance, 100 thoughts racing through her mind. Clint had told her to run, but she couldn't leave him behind. Not after everything they'd been through. Clint's voice echoed in her mind. You go now. But he hadn't followed. He wasn't here. Rachel's fingers flexed around her gun, and for a moment, she considered just pushing forward and getting out of there. She could go for help, call in reinforcements. But that was the last thing Clint would want her to do. He would never forgive her if she abandoned him now. Not when they were so close. Without thinking twice, Rachel turned and bolted back inside the building. She knew the risks. She knew the odds. But Clint needed her, and she wasn't going to leave him to face whatever Caldwell had planned alone. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime, and the echo of gunshots rang in her ears as she retraced her steps into the now eerily silent hallway. It was strange. Everything had gone quiet. No shouting, no more gunfire. Had Clint taken care of the remaining attackers? Was it safe now? Her instinct screamed at her to be cautious. No one was ever really safe when Caldwell was involved. Rachel crouched low and moved through the dim hallway, her senses alert for any signs of danger. The walls seemed to close in on her as she navigated the maze of corridors, each turn leading her deeper into the heart of the building. The faintest sound of movement caught her attention, and she pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It was him, Clint. She could hear his voice, though it was barely a whisper. He was just ahead. She crept forward, careful to keep herself hidden from view. The last thing she needed was to make a sound and alert anyone to her presence. As she rounded the corner, there he was, Clint, standing over the bodies of the men he'd taken down. His back was turned, but his posture was tense, as if he were listening for something. She breathed a sigh of relief at the sight of him. He was alive. But for how long? Clint, she called softly, stepping into view. Clint spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But when he saw it was Rachel, his body relaxed. His eyes softened in that brief moment of relief, but they were still clouded with worry. Rachel, he said, his voice hoarse. What the hell are you doing here? I told you to leave. Rachel shook her head. Not without you. He gave her a tight smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You should have kept running. It's too dangerous. Rachel shook her head again. You know I can't do that. Not when you're still in here. Clint let out a sharp breath, and for a moment, he just stood there, his brow furrowed. I'm glad you're here, but we don't have time for this. We need to move now. Caldwell's not done yet. He's playing some kind of game, and we're still caught in it. Rachel glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the bodies of the attackers Clint had eliminated. Then let's finish it. Clint nodded, his gaze sharpening. We need to head for the main control room. That's where he's hiding. It's the only way to get to him now. Rachel took a deep breath and nodded. Let's do it. The two of them quickly moved through the building, retracing their steps as best as they could. The corridors were eerily quiet, but both knew that silence was the calm before the storm. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Clint's instincts told him they were getting close. They'd already taken out most of Caldwell's men, but something about the way the building felt now, the stillness, gave him an uneasy feeling. It was too quiet, as if the storm was just beginning. They reached the door to the control room, and Clint motioned for Rachel to stay back. He wanted to take a quick look first, make sure they weren't walking into an ambush. Stay here. Let me check, he said quietly. Rachel nodded, her hand resting on the grip of her gun. She trusted Clint's judgment. He had led them through worse situations before. But that didn't mean she was going to stand by idly while he faced whatever was inside. Clint edged closer to the door, his gun raised, his steps slow and deliberate. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open just enough to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Caldwell was there, sitting at the center of a large table in the middle of the room. He wasn't alone. Several more armed men surrounded him, their faces cold and unreadable. And standing next to Caldwell, a man Clint had never seen before, was a familiar sight. An explosive device, carefully placed in the center of the room. Rachel's voice cut through Clint's shock. "Clint, what's going on?" Clint's mind raced. There was no time to explain. He had to act, and fast. Caldwell was planning something big, something deadly. The bomb had to be disabled before it was too late. He motioned to Rachel. "We have to move. They've rigged the control room with explosives." Rachel's eyes widened, her heart racing. "You're telling me he has a bomb in there?" Clint nodded grimly. "And I'm betting it's connected to the whole building. If we don't stop him now, we're all dead." Rachel's mind was already working as fast as her heart was pounding. "How do we get in?" Clint didn't hesitate. "We take him down, and I'll handle the bomb." They didn't waste any more time. The moment was now or never. They both moved with purpose, positioning themselves at the door. There was no turning back now. Clint took a deep breath, his hand tightening on his weapon. It was time to finish this. The air in the corridor felt thick, almost suffocating, as Clint and Rachel positioned themselves outside the control room door. The plan was simple: disarm the bomb, take down Caldwell, and get out alive. It was a dangerous mission, but Clint had no choice. This was their only shot. Clint's mind raced as he eyed the control room door. Caldwell's smug face flashed through his mind. The man had orchestrated everything, from the betrayal to the relentless pursuit. And now, he had one final trick up his sleeve: a bomb. It was the kind of desperate move Clint expected from a man like Caldwell. Clint's fingers gripped his gun tightly. He was ready. But the question was, would he be fast enough? The explosive device they had spotted earlier was the key. If they didn't disable it within minutes, the entire building would go down with them. And with Caldwell's men surrounding the room, getting close would be a feat in itself. Rachel glanced at Clint, her eyes filled with concern. "What's the plan?" Clint's voice was low and steady. "We go in. We take out Caldwell's men first. Then, I'll disable the bomb." Rachel nodded, her face set in determination. "And Caldwell?" Clint's eyes darkened. "I'll deal with him." He could already feel the pressure mounting. Time was ticking, and every second counted. With a final look at Rachel, Clint gave the signal. They were going in. Clint pushed open the door slowly, the squeak of the hinges betraying their stealthy approach. The room was large, filled with monitors and equipment, all wired into the security system of the building. At the center of the room sat Caldwell, flanked by his remaining men. He was calm, collected, and eerily composed. His eyes locked onto Clint the moment he entered, a cold smile forming on his lips. "Well, well," Caldwell said with a mocking chuckle. "The prodigal son returns. I was wondering when you'd show up." Clint's eyes narrowed. "It's over, Caldwell. This ends now." Caldwell didn't seem fazed. He leaned back in his chair, resting his hands behind his head. "You think it's that easy? You and your little friend are out of your depth. You can't stop me. The bomb's already set. It's just a matter of time." Clint's gaze flickered to the bomb, a large device sitting on a table near the back of the room. The digital timer on it was ticking down steadily. They had minutes, maybe less. Rachel stepped forward, her gun raised. "We'll see about that." But Caldwell's men didn't hesitate. They immediately drew their weapons, and the room erupted into chaos. Clint and Rachel dove behind a nearby console, narrowly avoiding a hail of bullets. The sound of gunfire filled the room, and Clint's heart raced in his chest. He was used to combat, used to high-pressure situations, but this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for his life now. He was fighting to save everyone in the building. Clint poked his head up just long enough to take a shot, hitting one of Caldwell's men in the shoulder. The man staggered back, but he didn't go down. Clint's hand tightened around his gun, his mind calculating his next move. Rachel leaned over the console, firing her weapon with deadly precision. She hit another of Caldwell's men, sending him sprawling to the floor. But there were more. Too many more. "We need to get to the bomb," Clint yelled over the gunfire. Rachel nodded, her face set with determination. She wasn't backing down. Clint and Rachel made a break for it, moving quickly from cover to cover, dodging bullets that flew past them. The air was thick with tension, and Clint's heart pounded harder with each step. Every time he looked over his shoulder, another enemy was closing in, but they kept pushing forward. Finally, they reached the table with the bomb. Clint's hands were shaking as he examined the device. It was big, it was complicated, and it was wired to the building's security system. If he didn't disable it in time, they were all dead. Rachel kept her gun aimed at the remaining attackers, firing whenever they got too close. "Hurry up, Clint!" she shouted, her voice strained. Clint ignored the panic rising in his chest and focused. He had done this before, but never with so much on the line. His fingers moved with precision, disconnecting wires, cutting the power supply. The timer was still ticking down, a constant reminder that they didn't have much time left. As he worked, he could feel the weight of Caldwell's gaze on him. The man wasn't moving, just watching, waiting for Clint to fail. "You really think you can stop it?" Caldwell's voice was low, almost amused. "You're too late, Clint. There's no escape from this." Clint didn't respond. He just kept working, each move deliberate and calm despite the chaos unfolding around him. Time seemed to slow as he made his final adjustments. He could feel Rachel's presence behind him, her eyes watching every move he made, but there was no room for error. And then, with a click, the timer stopped. Clint let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The bomb was disabled. They were safe, for now, but they weren't out of danger yet. Clint stood up slowly, turning to face Caldwell. The man's smug smile had faltered, but he was still calm. Too calm. Clint took a step forward. "It's over, Caldwell." The door behind them burst open, and a group of armed men flooded into the room. Clint's heart sank. They were surrounded, but Rachel didn't flinch. She raised her gun again, ready for whatever came next. "We're not done yet," Rachel said, her voice steady. Caldwell's smile returned, but this time, it was tinged with desperation. "You think you can beat me? I have everything under control. You're just pawns in my game." Clint shook his head. "Not anymore." The standoff was brief. The next few moments passed in a blur of gunfire, shouting, and the sound of bodies hitting the floor. But despite the odds, Clint and Rachel were winning. One by one, Caldwell's men fell, unable to keep up with their precision and determination. Finally, it was just Clint and Caldwell left in the room. Clint's eyes locked with Caldwell's. The final confrontation. "You're finished," Clint said, his voice cold. But Caldwell only smiled, a dark glint in his eyes. "You think so, Clint? I think the game's just beginning." Clint's finger tightened on the trigger. The tension in the room was suffocating. Clint stood facing Caldwell, the last man left between them and freedom. The sound of gunfire had finally ceased, and all that remained was the steady hum of the air conditioning, a cruel reminder of the quiet that had fallen in the aftermath of the battle. Caldwell's smile never wavered, his eyes flickering with something that bordered on amusement. It was clear that, in his twisted mind, this wasn't over. He didn't know how to lose, and Clint knew that was dangerous. A man like Caldwell was more dangerous when cornered. "You're done, Caldwell," Clint said, his voice steady. "You don't have any more tricks left." Caldwell chuckled darkly. "You really think you've won? You think you're the hero in this story?" His gaze flicked to the bomb, now rendered useless. "You're all just players in a bigger game than you can imagine." Clint's eyes narrowed. He wasn't about to let Caldwell bait him into a psychological game. The fight had been long, hard, and filled with moments of doubt and fear. But now, it was just about one thing, ending it. "You've hurt a lot of people," Clint said, taking a slow step forward. His voice remained cold, but the anger simmering beneath the surface was palpable. "And you're going to pay for it." Rachel stood just behind Clint, her weapon still in hand, watching Caldwell closely. They both knew that if Caldwell had any final moves left, they had to be prepared. Caldwell's expression hardened. "You think I'm afraid of you, Clint? You think I care about a little thing like justice?" "I don't care what you care about," Clint shot back. "I care about stopping you, and I will." Clint took another step, his gaze unwavering. Caldwell was backed into a corner now, physically and mentally. The fight was over, even if Caldwell couldn't accept it yet. Clint's fingers tightened on the trigger of his gun, his mind made up. But just as he was about to make the final move, a loud explosion shook the building. The walls seemed to vibrate with the force, and the lights flickered overhead. Rachel gasped, instinctively reaching for Clint's arm. What the hell was that? Clint's eyes shot to Caldwell, and for a brief moment, he saw something change in the man's expression, a fleeting panic. That wasn't part of the plan, Caldwell muttered, looking around frantically. No, no, no. Clint's heart skipped a beat. He understood what had just happened. That explosion wasn't an accident. Someone, somewhere, had just triggered a new threat. The danger wasn't over. Clint, Rachel shouted, her voice breaking through his thoughts. We need to get out of here. Now. Clint's instincts kicked in. He didn't hesitate. They had to move, and they had to move fast. He grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her toward the door. But Caldwell wasn't finished yet. In a desperate move, Caldwell lunged toward a nearby control panel, his hand scrambling to hit the emergency button. Clint's eyes widened as he realized what Caldwell was about to do. The building was rigged to collapse. Caldwell's finger hovered over the button, but before he could press it, Clint was already there. With one swift motion, he knocked Caldwell's hand away and tackled him to the ground. The two men crashed onto the floor, struggling for control. Rachel moved in to help, but just as she reached for Caldwell, he kicked Clint off him and scrambled to his feet, eyes wild. Do you really think you've won? Caldwell spat, his voice hoarse. It's too late. You're all going to die here. Clint's mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. They couldn't let Caldwell activate the self-destruct sequence. The building was already unstable, and if he pushed that button, they would never make it out alive. With adrenaline surging through his veins, Clint rose to his feet, grabbing Caldwell by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The sound of crunching metal filled the room as Clint pinned Caldwell there, his face inches from his. You're done, Clint growled. You've got nothing left. Caldwell, blood trickling from his lip, managed to let out a laugh, his eyes gleaming with twisted amusement. You think you're the hero? You're just another part of the problem, Clint. You'll never fix what's broken. Clint shook his head. You're wrong. It ends here. You're not going to hurt anyone else. With that, Clint grabbed Caldwell's wrist, keeping him pinned while Rachel quickly moved to disable the control panel that was set to trigger the building's destruction. The seconds felt like hours as she worked, sweat beading on her forehead. Clint didn't take his eyes off Caldwell, who now struggled weakly in his grip, trying to free himself. Almost there, Rachel muttered. Suddenly, another rumble shook the building, and this time, it wasn't from the explosion. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Clint's gut tightened. They didn't have much time. Finally, Rachel's voice rang out, Got it. The self-destruct's disabled. Clint exhaled in relief, though his body was still tense. They weren't out of danger yet, but at least the immediate threat had passed. The building wasn't going to collapse. Not today. With Caldwell subdued and the threat neutralized, Clint turned to Rachel, his voice rough but relieved. Let's go. It's over. But as they started to move, a new sound filled the room, the distant whine of sirens. Emergency personnel were closing in, likely responding to the explosion. They had no more time to waste. The two of them exchanged a quick glance before turning and rushing for the exit. They had been through hell and back, but they weren't finished yet. The building wasn't safe, and Caldwell was still a danger. But for now, Clint was determined to leave that place behind, to get Rachel out, and to make sure that Caldwell would never hurt anyone again. They reached the exit, bursting into the night air, and they didn't look back. As they jogged away from the building, the distant lights of the city flickering in the background, Clint allowed himself one brief moment of relief. The danger was over, and they had survived. But in the back of his mind, a question lingered. Was it really over? Or had they just walked away from the calm before an even greater storm? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?